Every night at exactly midnight, the sky darkened with a dense and heavy fog, while the first drops of the storm fell on the city. No one knew where they came from, or why they appeared so punctually. It seemed like a blessing at first, freshening the air and bringing relief to the sweltering warmth of the city. But as the days went by, the rain began to awaken something much darker, something that no one dared to understand. At 12 o'clock, the first drops fell gently, followed by a rain that intensified rapidly. No one dared to leave their homes when the sound of the storm began to fill everything. It was as if the rain had a life of its own, a being that felt strangely aware, as if it were watching. But the most disturbing feature of those rains was not only their arrival, they were the whispers. As the rain fell heavily, the wind rose, dragging with it voices, incomprehensible murmurs that ran through the empty streets. No one knew where they came from, but every night the whisper grew louder, closer, as if someone was right behind them, breathing into their necks. The figures also appeared, blurred shadows that faded when they were directly observed. Human silhouettes, but with an anomaly. Whenever they looked out into the rain, those figures would disappear into the mist, as if they had never been there. Still, everyone knew they were there, lurking in the dark. The first to notice something strange were the children, small creatures that, without understanding the danger, played in the rain. But the laughter soon turned to terrified screams. Those who played near the storm began to see those figures, and some even swore they had touched them. They said that the sensation was as if the figures' hands were cold and wet, and when they touched them, they felt a pressure that made them shudder to the bone. Worst of all, when the children tried to run away, something stopped them. Their feet were glued to the ground, as if the earth itself were holding them back, as if an invisible force was dragging them back into the rain. That's when the city began to speak. The elders knew something. Everyone knew the legend, although no one dared to tell it out loud. They said that long before the city was founded, there was a small town that fell under a curse brought by an eternal storm that fell every midnight, bringing with it fear-feeding figures. No one could escape, and no one survived to tell what happened. The city had been built on the ruins of that village, but the rain, according to the elders, never went away. I had been waiting. One night, after several days in a row of heavy rains, a group of young people decided to investigate. Armed with flashlights and cameras, they drove into the center of the city, hoping to find a logical explanation. The rain began to fall with the same precision as always at 12 o'clock. As they walked through the deserted streets, the wind began to rustle, but this time it was different. The murmurs were not just whispers, they seemed like words that crept into their minds. At one point, one of the young men, Thomas, began to speak loudly, as if responding to someone. The others tried to stop him, but he kept walking, his eyes empty as if he were in a trance. "We can't escape. There's no way out," he murmured, his voice cracking with fear. "They are waiting for us. They are always here." The rain was falling harder now, and the murmurs turned into screams, distorted voices that filled the air with despair. The figures began to appear, gliding in the fog, slowly moving towards the group of young people. Some tried to flee, but their feet were no longer responding. Something was holding them back. Those who dared to look back saw those figures getting closer and closer, and although the shadows were vague, they could sense the presence of something much more sinister. Suddenly, one of the figures stopped in front of Thomas. His face was shrouded in shadows, but his silhouette was clear, a human figure standing in front of him. Thomas stretched out his hand as if he wanted to touch it, but the moment his fingers brushed against the figure, a heart-rending scream filled the air, and the shadow vanished into the mist, leaving only the feeling of an icy hand taking hold of his heart. The others screamed as they saw Tomas fall to the ground, his body stiff, his face distorted by terror. No one could understand what had happened. They had tried to escape, but something kept them trapped in that place. The air was getting denser, as if the storm was absorbing all the light, leaving only a dense, heavy darkness that surrounded them completely. That's when they started to see something even more terrifying. Out of the shadows emerged hundreds, perhaps thousands of figures, all with the same empty faces, all approaching with frightening slowness. The shadows intertwined, forming a mass, as if they were united by an invisible force. The air was filled with whispers, murmurs of voices speaking in forgotten languages in low, guttural tones that penetrated the brain. Some of the young men tried to run again, but their bodies were no longer responding. They felt that the city itself was holding them back, that the ground was sticky, as if the earth was alive and dragging them in. The rain was falling harder, and the air smelled of dampness, of putrefaction. Suddenly, a large shadow emerged from the center of the city, larger than all the others. Its silhouette was huge, imposing, and seemed to be made of fog but so dense that it seemed solid. "Fears are never forgotten," whispered a deep voice echoing through the air. "We have fed off the city for generations. This rain, this storm, is nothing more than a reminder of what we left behind." The young people, paralyzed by terror, could barely move a finger. The figure drew closer, and as he did so, the whispers increased, mingling with blood-curdling screams and sobs. There was no way to escape. The whole city seemed to be alive, breathing, stalking, waiting. Then, with one last whisper of despair, the young people were swallowed by the shadows. The figures vanished as quickly as they had appeared, and the rain stopped. At dawn, when the sunlight finally reached the city, everything seemed to be calm. But in the streets, on the walls of the buildings, there remained the marks of those who had disappeared, marks that would never fade. The midnight rain had claimed others, and the city, already lifeless, was left waiting for the next storm, the next victim. And each night, at exactly midnight, the drops began to fall once more, followed by the whispers and figures that were always there, waiting. The sound began subtly, almost like a murmur. At first, he didn't pay attention to it. He thought it might be the sound of old plumbing or some broken pipe. But as the days went by, the noises became more constant, louder. They weren't casual noises like the creaking of an old structure or the wind pushing against windows. It was something else, something that froze his skin and made the hairs on the back of his neck stand on end. Martin's apartment was not big. It was a modest space in an old building in a city where the buildings seemed to be so close to each other that their walls often touched. It wasn't luxurious, but it was his. In his life, he had accepted solitude as a constant companion. With each passing day, the stillness of her home brought her peace. That peace, however, slowly began to crumble as the noises intensified. At first, he thought he was crazy, that maybe he was losing his mind. Throughout her life, she had dealt with stress and anxiety, but something about those sounds was just fine for her. Disturbing. They were low, almost unintelligible at first. A soft tapping, a deep vibration that didn't come from the walls but from somewhere below. Would they be the foundations of the building? The old elevator that went up and down at all hours? But the nights passed and the noises grew, as did the feeling that something was not right. They were no longer mere tapping. Now he could hear whispers, as if someone was whispering his name from the shadows of the floor below. The first real awakening of the restlessness occurred one night. After several weeks of hearing those strange sounds, Martin woke up in the middle of the night, agitated, sweat soaking his forehead. He sat up quickly, trembling, as if something had touched him. There was a chill in the air, a chill that did not come from the open window but seemed to emanate from the walls themselves. It was then that he heard it clearly, a dragging, as if something heavy was dragging on the ground. He was not human. It couldn't be. The feeling of dread enveloped him completely. Without thinking, he got out of bed and went out into the hallway. He looked at the door of the apartment next door. It was empty. It had always been empty. There had never been anyone on the lower floor. Martin had investigated at first, looking for answers to those noises, but he had never found anything. Something didn't fit. Something in that building was completely wrong. He decided to take matters into his own hands. If the noises were coming from the lower floor and no one was there, then what was causing them? And why did he feel those noises calling to him, as if someone were whispering to him in the dark? The basement door was locked, but that didn't stop Martin. That night, armed with a flashlight and a determination that arose from pure fear, he went into the basement. At first, his flashlight barely shone a couple of meters in front of him, but as he advanced, the air became denser. The stench, as of stagnant moisture, filled his lungs and made him cough. Something was not right. Not only was the air strange, but the walls seemed to be full of scars, marks I couldn't identify. The feeling that someone was watching him grew with each step he took. Suddenly, the flashlight flickered. Darkness grew around him, and for a moment he thought the world was fading away. Then a noise made him stop. A dull thud, a creak, as if something heavy was moving in the dark. Martin swallowed hard and kept going, although his body asked him to flee. Finally, the flashlight shone on a figure, a shadow in the darkest corner of the basement. The first thing he noticed was the shape of this creature. Its body was tall, skeletal, covered in pale gray skin that seemed to absorb light. The eyes, if I could call them eyes, were two black, empty orbs, glowing with a yellow, inhuman light. That creature was not human nor animal. It was something much older, something that was hiding in the shadows, feeding on something I couldn't understand. Martin could not move. He was paralyzed with terror. The creature, with slow but sure movements, began to crawl towards him. Every step he took echoed off the walls as if the ground was shaking. Martin tried to back up, but his legs did not respond. Fear had trapped him. The creature got closer and closer. A cold breath ran down Martin's back, and darkness closed around him. He could feel the weight of that presence, as if he were being absorbed by it, as if the shadows themselves were surrounding him, taking possession of his being. At that moment, the flashlight flickered again, and in the darkness, Martin could hear a whisper, one he would never forget. "It's too late." The shadow of the creature spread through the basement, and Martin, unable to react, fell to the ground. The creature silently moved even closer, brushing its skin with its icy touch. The creature then began to speak in a strange whisper, a murmur that seemed to penetrate its mind. He told him dark stories, stories of those who had fallen before him, those who had come too close to the lower floor and paid the price. There were beings, entities, dwelling in darkness, waiting to be awakened. Martin, hearing those words, felt his soul being torn apart. An indescribable fear consumed him as the creature dragged him into the shadows. At that moment, Martin understood the worst of all. Not only was the creature a being who lived in darkness, but that darkness was his home, and he had stepped into his realm beyond what was allowed. Terror enveloped every corner of the apartment as the figure disappeared from their sight. No one saw Martin again. No one heard the strange noises coming from the lower floor again. The creature, however, continued to wait, feeding on the darkness and the lost souls that time and again fell into its trap. A few months later, a new tenant moved into the building, and that same night, the whispers on the lower floor began again. Whitehaven Island, a small, isolated piece of land in the middle of the murky waters of the North Sea, had been a mystery for years. For a long time, the few inhabitants who remained on its shores lived a quiet life, without much contact with the rest of the world. The island, though small and modest, was steeped in ancient history, full of secrets buried under layers of land forgotten by time. But all that changed on a gray autumn afternoon when a group of tourists, in their eagerness to know the place and its mysteries, decided to venture on the island without knowing what awaited them. The group never returned. Local authorities, alarmed by the unexplained disappearance, sent several expeditions in search of the tourists, but never found a trace of their presence. Weeks turned into months, months into years, and the case of the missing from Whitehaven went from front-page news to a story forgotten by most. No one knew what had happened on the island. However, the rumors did not stop. 5 years after the group's demise, things began to change. Stories were whispered among the locals of strange sightings and unexplained occurrences. Bright lights on the darkest nights, shadows moving through the trees, and unmistakable voices in the breeze that seemed to carry echoes of something lost. However, what most terrified those who lived in the vicinity was the growing number of stories about people who said they had returned from the island. People who had disappeared for years, but now walked the streets of the town again. At first, people thought they were simple coincidences, but as time progressed, the stories became more disturbing. No one seemed to be able to explain the return of the disappeared, let alone the strange behaviors exhibited by those who claimed to have returned. Many people were skeptical, but those who met these people soon began to feel a chill running down their spine. The people who returned were not the same. There was something deeply altered in their eyes, something that made them seem different, empty, as if they were living in a parallel reality, completely disconnected from the life they had known before. The whole town began to murmur. No one knew what had happened on Whitehaven Island. No one knew what had changed those tourists who at first seemed to be ordinary people. A sense of fear and distrust took hold of the locals, and those returning from the island could not fit in. There was something inhuman about them, something that couldn't be explained in words. At first, those affected tried to continue with their lives, trying to reintegrate into the village and their former circles. However, over time, their behaviors became more bizarre and puzzling. Some of them were talking about things that no one understood, as if they were repeating the same phrases in a forgotten or unintelligible language. Others were silent, with an empty and disconnected expression, as if they could not remember anything from their previous life. The people close to them were beginning to feel a sense of unease, as if something dark and dangerous was surrounding them. The town's mayor, concerned about the growing number of incidents, called a meeting in the central square. On the night before the meeting, one of the returnees, a woman named Clara, disappeared again without a trace, only to appear at dawn in the center of the village, covered in dirt and with a completely empty expression. The few witnesses who saw her came to an agreement. Something had changed inside her, something deeply disturbing. At the meeting, the villagers were frantically arguing about what to do with those who returned. Some believed they should be isolated, others feared they might be a threat. Panic took hold of everyone when the stories began to arrive more frequently. No one knew if those who were returning were really the people who had disappeared, or if something else had taken them, altering them, transforming them into something else. It was at that moment that a young researcher named Samuel arrived in town. Samuel was a freelance journalist, known for his desire to unravel the darkest mysteries, and he had heard about the strange happenings in Whitehaven. He decided to travel to the island to discover the truth behind the returnees. With the approval of the local authorities, Samuel boarded a small boat to the island. As he approached the shore, he couldn't help but feel that something in the air was deeply wrong. The sky was covered by dark clouds, and the sea seemed more violent than normal. Whitehaven Island, which had once been quiet, now seemed to radiate an unsettling energy. Upon arrival, Samuel began to explore the island. In his first steps, he noticed something strange. The place was deserted with no signs of life, as if the island itself had been forgotten by time. But as he moved further inland, Samuel realized he wasn't alone. I could feel it. Something was watching his movements. Walking among the trees and moss-covered rocks, Samuel found what looked like a cave hidden among the hills. Intrigued, he went into it. Darkness enveloped him as he advanced through the narrow passage. And then, at the bottom of the cave, he saw something that left him cold. A set of strange symbols were etched into the walls of the cave, symbols that did not belong to any known culture. They were ancient, so profoundly old that they defied human logic. As Samuel watched them, a sense of anguish came over him. He felt as if something was awakening in the depths of the island, something he had been waiting for centuries. Suddenly the cave began to tremble, and a strange vibration ran through his entire body. Samuel tried to get out, but the walls seemed to move, closing around him. It was then that he heard voices, soft at first, like a whisper in the distance. The voices grew louder, closer, until suddenly they stopped. And then he saw something he would never forget. The missing tourists, the same ones who had returned to the village, were standing in front of him, their eyes empty and their bodies motionless. They were there, but they were not the same. Something had transformed them. Something had possessed them. At that moment, Samuel understood what had happened. The island had not only been a place of isolation, it had been a point of convergence, a space where dark forces had infiltrated the human world. The people who returned were not human. They had been altered, possessed by an ancestral entity that controlled them. And that entity had been patiently waiting for his return. As the island began to crumble around him, Samuel tried to flee but couldn't. Darkness surrounded him, and the voices of the missing were transformed into deafening screams. The cave swallowed it all, and Whitehaven Island, with all its secrets and horrors, was sealed forever. The villagers never heard of Samuel again. The returnees, if they could still be called that, continued to wander the streets, their gaze empty and their soul lost forever. And the island, with its hidden terror, continued to wait for the next victim. A group of 5 friends, all with hiking experience, decided to go on a trip to the Shadow Hill Forest. They had heard the stories and legends that haunted that place since they were children. Stories that spoke of unexplained disappearances, of people who never returned after entering the forest. However, what originally seemed to be a challenging adventure would quickly turn into a nightmare that would test not only his bravery, but his deepest fears. The sun was beginning to set when they reached the edge of the Shadow Hill Forest. The treetops formed a dark blanket that blocked much of the light. Despite the sinister reputation of that place, the 5 friends did not let fear stop them. They were used to walking in nature, and they believed that stories were just that, stories. They decided to camp near a clearing, a small open area between the trees, which offered them a quiet view of the starry sky. They prepared to spend a relaxed night surrounded by nature, not knowing that this would be the last moment of calm they would experience. As the night wore on, the shadows of the forest seemed to lengthen, and a strange stillness came over the place. None of the friends could remember exactly when it started, but something changed in the air. The wind stopped blowing, and a deep silence invaded the space. Suddenly, one of the group members, Sarah, felt someone watching her. He turned toward the forest, looking for some sign, but saw nothing but the impenetrable darkness of the trees. "Did you hear that?" asked Sarah, her voice trembling slightly. The others were silent, listening intently, but there was no response. Everything was too quiet, as if the forest itself was holding its breath. A few minutes later, the silence was broken by the sound of something rustling in the distance, as if someone were walking through the dry foliage. "It's just the wind," Mark said, trying to sound confident, but his tone wasn't as convincing as he thought. Suddenly, a piercing scream broke the stillness, coming from somewhere nearby. They all got up, terrified, looking around. The sound was so close, but they couldn't see anything. "What was that?" muttered John, his voice raspy on. The group decided that it would be best to leave the camp and return to the starting point, but something prevented them from moving. A sense of unease bound them to the ground, as if the forest would not let them escape. That's when something strange began to happen. Sarah, the most intrepid of the group, stepped forward and began to walk into the woods. "I'm going to investigate," he said without hesitation. The others tried to stop her, but something in her eyes made them hesitate. She seemed to be being drawn to something beyond her comprehension. Suddenly, Sarah disappeared into the trees, as if the forest itself had swallowed her. His friends called his name, but there was no answer. The darkness swallowed all sound, and panic began to take hold of them. "Sarah!" Mark shouted desperately, running to where he had last seen her. But when he reached the edge of the forest, he found only a series of strange footprints, deeply marked on the ground, which disappeared into the blackness of the forest. There was no trace of her. The friends stared at the footprints, terrified. They knew something wasn't right, but the darkness prevented them from seeing beyond. They decided to look for it, but as they went along, the atmosphere of the forest seemed to become denser, as if they were being watched by something they couldn't comprehend. The footprints were getting stranger, as if something had painted them on purpose. "This doesn't make sense," muttered Emma, who was visibly shaking. "Why are there symbols on trees?" The symbols were strange, incomprehensible, with geometric shapes that did not correspond to any culture they knew. The figures seemed to move subtly, as if they had a life of their own. The feeling that someone or something was stalking them intensified. Every time they approached one of the symbols, a cold current ran through their bodies, and a shiver ran through them. The group, now completely nervous and not knowing what to do, decided to return to the camp to think of a plan. But when they arrived, something worse awaited them. The camp was completely messy. The backpacks were open, the equipment was scattered on the ground, and the campfire had already been extinguished. The scariest thing, however, was the fact that Sarah's footprints were still there. But instead of disappearing into the forest, they were returning to the camp, surrounding the area where they were now. "What's going on here?" John whispered, his eyes filled with terror. A low, almost imperceptible whisper hung in the air. It seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at the same time. "Help! Help! Help!" he repeated, echoing like an echo. "It's Sarah!" shouted Emma, hoping she was still nearby. But the echo only multiplied, repeating the name of each member of the group, distorted and sinister. In the background, something moved quickly among the trees. A low whistle, like that of a creature in the dark, cut through the air. Panic broke out. Suddenly, Mark disappeared. None of them saw him leave, but when they turned their heads to look for him, he was gone. Only the footprints remained, which seemed to crawl into the forest, into the deep and unreachable. With terror running high, the group began to run, but every step they took seemed to be in vain. The forest, which had at first seemed like a challenge, now closed in on them like a trap. Darkness enveloped them. Branches creaked as if something was moving quickly, and the voices of their missing comrades echoed in their ears. One by one, the figures of friends began to disappear. First Emma, then John, and finally only Clara remained, looking around in horror. unable to comprehend what was happening. She looked up at the sky, looking for the moon, looking for the light, but everything seemed to get even darker. The ground beneath his feet began to shake, and then he saw it. From deep within the forest, a tall, thin figure emerged from the shadows. It wasn't human, but it wasn't a beast either. His face was covered by a black cloak, and his eyes shone with a deep, piercing green glow that seemed to pierce his soul. The creature raised a hand, and Clara felt a pressure in her chest, an excruciating pain that forced her to fall to her knees. "Welcome, Clara," whispered a deep, guttural voice, as if coming from the very bowels of the forest. "You're the last." With a final scream, Clara disappeared, swallowed by the darkness. The forest of Shadow Hill had claimed its last victim. The echoes of the lost voices echoed through the air, while the symbols on the trees shone with a spectral light. No one else came back from that forest. And the cycle continued, waiting for new unwary people who, like the group of hikers, would challenge the legend and disappear one by one into the darkness of Shadow Hill. Years ago, archaeologist Enrique Martinez had dedicated his life to the study of ancient cultures. Since he was a child, he had been attracted by history and vanished civilizations. He had traveled continents, unearthed secrets, and unraveled enigmas. But what awaited him that afternoon at an excavation in a remote South American village would surpass anything he had seen before. An old legend circulating in the local community told of a reliquary, an object of ancient power that possessed the ability to unleash the worst of horrors. In the village, they called it the Reliquary of Death. No one dared to approach the excavation area for fear that the dark forces would awaken. However, Henry, with his insatiable desire for knowledge and his skepticism about such stories, ignored the warnings and decided to delve deeper into the search. One day, after weeks of meticulous work, Enrique and his team discovered something they didn't expect. Among the rubble of a structure that dated back centuries, something metallic glowed faintly in the sunlight. At first, he thought it was just a piece of pottery, but as he cleaned it with great care, he soon realized that it was a locket, small but adorned with intricate engravings and strange symbols that seemed to move as he looked at them. With trembling hands and a mixture of excitement and caution, Henry grasped the locket. The piece seemed to have a life of its own. The aged gold shone in a way that hypnotized him. However, a shiver ran down his spine when, as he opened the locket, he felt a dark energy that was unleashed with a rumble that echoed in his chest. Suddenly, an icy air invaded the place, and the shadows seemed to lengthen, as if they wanted to devour him. Enrique took a step back, looking for the locket with his eyes, but it was too late. The evil had been released. Darkness took over his mind, and something inside him whispered, though he couldn't understand it. A heavy silence descended upon the camp. The men around him began to feel him, as if an unknown presence was stalking them, watching them from the shadows. That night, the first strange events began. The air grew heavier, the stars shone brightly, but they offered no comfort, only a warning. Enrique was alone in his tent when, suddenly, a feeling of extreme cold enveloped him. At first he thought it might be the wind, but he soon realized that it was not natural. The light of his flashlight flickered, then went out, and in the darkness he could hear a low, deep whisper, like the murmur of voices rising from the bowels of the earth itself. His hands trembled as he reached for his lighter, but as he did so, something stopped him. A pair of red eyes flashed in the darkness, watching him, looking at him with terrifying intensity. Enrique felt his heart racing, terror running through his skin. He tried to scream, but his voice choked in his throat, as if an invisible force was oppressing him. His eyes drew closer and closer until Enrique felt that he was about to be dragged into that darkness. The vision suddenly faded. The store returned to calm, but Enrique knew that it had not been a dream. Something had changed inside him. The locket had not only released an evil force, but it had also left a mark on his soul. The next day, he tried to continue his work, but the atmosphere grew denser each time he approached the locket. The men in the camp began to abandon the excavations, terrified by the manifestations of the paranormal that happened every night. The voices whispered louder, and the shadows seemed to move unnaturally. Many of the workers said they saw shadowy figures slipping into the corners of their eyes. Some even began to fall ill inexplicably. A couple of days later, Enrique began to experience horrible nightmares. In his dreams, he saw a figure wrapped in a dark cloak, with red eyes and a sinister smile. The figure called him, invited him to join her, to follow the path to death. Every time I woke up, I felt like I wasn't alone. An invisible presence watched him, always close. One night, in an attempt to stop what he had unleashed, Enrique returned to the place where he had found the locket. He was determined to seal it again, to return it to the place where it belonged. But when he arrived, he realized that he could not do it. The shadows around him grew thicker and the air became thick as lead. Each step he took toward the locket, the stronger the pressure felt. It was as if the earth itself was alive, rejecting him. Finally, when he reached for the locket, something changed. The ground began to shake and a deafening sound filled his ears. It was the creaking of the bowels of the earth. Suddenly a figure materialized in front of him, shrouded in absolute darkness. He had no face, just an endless shadow. His voice echoed in Enrique's mind. "Do you think you can stop the inevitable? Do you think you can escape the fate that belongs to you?" Enrique tried to take a step back, but his body was unresponsive. The figure surrounded him, and darkness took over his being. The screams of his fellow diggards, who had returned in search of answers, coalesced into the air, echoing in his mind like a distant echo. Then, everything vanished. When Enrique woke up, he was in a dark place, surrounded by shadows. I didn't know if he was alive or dead, but it didn't matter. The reliquary had already fulfilled its purpose. He had unleashed the evil he had sought so much. The terror was complete. The story of Enrique Martinez disappeared from the face of the earth. No one knows what happened to him or his team. The records of the excavation were destroyed and the reliquary never reappeared. Some say that echoes of their cry can be heard when the moon is full, echoing through the air as a warning to those seeking ancient objects with desires for power. The reliquary of death is still waiting in some hidden place for whoever dares to unleash terror once again. Daniel's apartment had always been his refuge, a place where the stillness of the night offered him the calm he needed so much after a tiring day. A space where shadows seemed to whisper secrets that only lonely people could understand. He had lived alone for years after the separation from his wife, and although loneliness sometimes overwhelmed him, he had learned to live with her. Life had lost its luster, but at least it remained stable. One night, as he was getting ready for sleep, Daniel noticed something strange. The digital clock light, which always flickered in the darkness of his room, seemed even dimmer than usual. Everything in the apartment was the same. The furniture in place, the TV off, the fresh air seeping through the cracks in the window. Everything seemed normal, but there was something unsettling in the air. Something I couldn't identify. He settled under the covers and closed his eyes, waiting for the dream to come as usual. However, that night something different happened. A whisper, low and barely audible, seeped into his consciousness. He thought it was a dream at first, but when he tried to ignore it, the voice became clearer, closer. "Daniel." The sound of his name, so clear in the gloom, made his skin crawl. It couldn't be possible. No one else was there. He got up quickly, looking around, but the apartment was empty, in complete silence. Even so, the voice persisted, slipping into his mind. "Daniel, you know what you did." A shiver ran down his spine. His heart began to pound, pounding his chest like a frantic drum. What was this? It couldn't be a hallucination. The voice sounded real, tangible, as if someone was in the room with him. He looked around, but there was nothing that could justify what he was hearing. The voice continued, this time with a deeper, more hissing tone, as if coming from the walls themselves. "You know what you did, and they will remind you." Daniel turned on the light from the bedside lamp, looking for a logical explanation. A dream? No, this was different. The feeling in his stomach was that of a real, palpable threat. The voice, although he couldn't see where it was coming from, seemed to come from everywhere at once. He tried to calm down, but the words echoed in his mind like an endless echo. The next morning, Daniel tried to ignore what he had experienced. He told himself that it had been just a nightmare, a manifestation of his tired mind. But that same night, when darkness took over her apartment again, the voice returned, stronger this time. "I'm watching you, I always have." Daniel got out of bed with instinctive speed, feeling that the temperature in the room had dropped drastically. The air became dense, heavy, as if the space was narrowing around him. There was no rational explanation that could be offered for what was happening, and fear began to take hold of him. He wondered if his sanity was beginning to crumble, if he was losing control of his mind. "Who are you?" he shouted, his voice trembling. The answer came in a whisper, but this time it was different. The voice not only spoke, but seemed to come from inside his own head, like an alien thought invading his personal space. "You know what I did, don't you? How did you forget me so easily?" The words struck his mind with such force that he fell to his knees. The voice seemed to come from a place I couldn't comprehend. His thoughts became cloudy and the sense of panic intensified. Doubt began to sow deep roots in his mind. He remembered the separation with his ex-wife, the decisions he made, the mistakes he made, but none of that seemed enough to justify the terror he felt. An idea began to form, with fear taking over his thoughts. Could this voice, this entity, be something related to his past? Something I had tried to escape from all those years? But the voice seemed to know everything, more than he wanted to admit. The next night, as darkness fell on the apartment, the voice returned with overwhelming insistence. Daniel couldn't take it anymore. He picked up his phone and called a friend, but the call dropped before he could say anything. Panic overwhelmed him. He was alone, completely alone. "Daniel, do you want to know the price of your decisions?" The room was cold, the air thick and stuffy, as if he were drowning in the presence of something he could not see. The furniture, the walls, the ceiling seemed to close in on him. Each shadow seemed to lengthen unnaturally, and the light from the lamp flickered faintly. The voice began to laugh, a low, guttural laugh seeping into his brain. The feeling that something was watching him, lurking around him, became unbearable. Daniel felt as if something was dragging him along, something dark that took hold of his soul, squeezing it, making him relive his worst fears. "You can't escape. You never can." Suddenly the sound of footsteps echoed in the hallway. They were slow, heavy steps, as if someone were walking with deliberate calm, approaching his door. Daniel's mind began to fragment. The voice continued to whisper, but he could no longer distinguish between reality and the nightmare that had taken hold of his mind. He got out of bed, but his legs didn't respond well. Anxiety dominated him. His breathing was agitated, and fear had paralyzed him. When he tried to open the door to get out, something stopped him. The door was locked from the outside, and a cold, invisible hand seemed to hold it firmly. "You know what you did. Remember?" The voice was much closer now. Terror seized him. His mind struggled to find a way out, but the shadows, thicker and denser, seemed to close in on him. He couldn't run away from his own darkness, from his own memories, from the decisions he'd made that were now in some way condemning him. Suddenly the door opened with a blood-curdling creak. Daniel took a step back, watching in horror as the figure of a woman appeared at the entrance. His eyes were empty, lifeless, and his face was a mask of pain and suffering. The woman walked toward him with terrifying slowness, as if every step she took was a sentence. "Do you remember me, Daniel?" It was as if the voice that had been harassing him for so long had finally taken shape. The woman in front of him seemed to be a manifestation of his own demons, his own guilt. Fear completely paralyzed him as the figure advanced toward him. He tried to scream, but his throat was closed and he couldn't make a sound. "Do you remember me, Daniel?" The voice repeated, this time louder, deeper, more terrifying. With a cry of despair, Daniel fell to the ground, his mind finally collapsing under the weight of the terror that had haunted him for so long. The woman leaned over him, her empty eyes fixed on his, and at that moment, Daniel understood. She was his ex-wife. The figure stared at him, smiling with an expression that mixed sadness and revenge. Before he could react, darkness completely enveloped him, and the last thing he heard was his own voice, whispering from somewhere inside his mind, "I told you, you can't escape." The room fell silent and the light went out. The shadows returned to the place where they had always been, but this time the dark presence had won. Daniel never woke up. The house stood lonely, surrounded by trees that seemed to whisper to each other with each gust of wind. Its facade, aged by the passage of time, crumbled to one side, but its structure remained imposing, like a shadow that hid forgotten stories. For Laura and her family, this place represented a new opportunity, a fresh start after years of hardship. They moved without much thought, attracted by the apparent tranquility of the countryside and the promise of a home that could offer them peace. It was a rainy Monday when they arrived, the water pounding against the windows furiously, but nothing seemed to break the solemn atmosphere around them. The mother, Laura, watched nervously as her children, Alan and Sophia, ran around the house exploring every corner while she organized the first boxes. The air smelled of old wood, but despite the humidity that permeated everything, The house seemed to have a presence of its own, something that could never be ignored. The first hours passed without any notable incident. The children laughed, and Laura tried to organize the kitchen, which was larger than she had imagined. But soon they began to notice something strange: the echoes. At first they thought it was part of the place, that the old walls amplified the sounds. But the truth was much more terrifying. It all started when Laura called her children for dinner. "Alan, Sophia, dinner is ready," he shouted from the hallway. But what he answered was not the voice of his son or daughter, but a deep, guttural voice that seemed to come from the walls themselves. "Laura," the voice whispered, but it wasn't she who was listening to it. It was an alien voice, deep, ancient, that slipped through the house like a shadow. Laura thought it was a joke, but her children's eyes widened when they heard the answer. "Did you hear that?" asked Alan blankly. Laura tried to calm the children, assuring them that it was just the sound of the house, but as the days passed, the echoes began to become more persistent. At first, the voices only repeated what was being said, but soon they began to alter the words. "Laura, look for what you forgot," he whispered once, while Laura, alone in the library, turned slowly at the bewildering message. What had I forgotten? I couldn't remember. The echoes began to take on a more tangible form, as if the voices could see something she didn't. As she explored the house, she found old photos in the attic, faded images of people she didn't know. One of the portraits caught his attention, a man with a grim expression looking toward the camera with eyes full of despair. The house had secrets, and the echoes were just the beginning. One night, while the family was having dinner in the dining room, Sophia asked something that made the air freeze. "Mom, who is the man in the attic photo?" he asked innocently. Laura felt a chill run down her spine. She hadn't mentioned anything about the photo. "What man?" he muttered, but before he could ask, the voice of the man in the photo spoke in the dining room. "Look at what you're hiding." Panic gripped Laura, but she still tried to rationalize what was happening. The voices were echoes, nothing more than that. But every time someone spoke, the echoes responded, and over time they began to reveal darker secrets. The man in the photo, the voice whispering in the night, began to put together pieces of a strange puzzle. That house had not only been his refuge, but also his prison. Laura began to investigate the history of the house, but the more she investigated, the more terrifying the revelation became. The house had originally been built by a man named Samuel, a hermit who had disappeared without a trace, but not before he had committed terrible acts. He had used the house as a refuge for those he had recruited from other nearby villages. No one knew for sure what was going on within the walls of the mansion, but the echoes, the whispers of those who had passed by, had never been extinguished. One night, while Laura was sleeping in her room, something strange happened. The echoes grew louder and louder, more intense until they began to transform into heart-rending screams. "Help, help me!" shouted a female voice, and Laura woke up breathing heavily. He got out of bed, trembling, and walked down the hall. In the mirror at the entrance, she saw her reflection, but she was not alone. Someone else was there, a shadow that vanished before he could scream. That same night, Alan and Sophia began to have nightmares. They woke up sobbing, terrified by the voices that spoke to them from the walls. "We are here with you," whispered the voices, as if they were trapped in the place. It wasn't just a game. It wasn't just an old house. They were trapped in something much bigger, something darker. Anxiety was building up in Laura. As the days went by, the echoes began to reveal more personal, deeper things. "Your mother is in danger," the voices whispered to Sophia, and then to Alan before they could tell Laura. Something was crumbling in the walls, and she could feel it. One day, Laura returned to the attic and found something that left her cold. A small old leather notebook, full of words written in dark ink. The words were written in a hurried manner, with palpable desperation. It was Samuel's story, but it was also his family's. He had invoked a dark covenant, one that bound him to the house forever, and to all those who moved there. He had used his own children. He had done horrible things to them, and the echoes were their trapped souls, doomed to repeat their cries eternally. Laura tried to destroy the notebook, burn it, but the echoes increased in intensity, and the voices began to scream louder. "You can't escape," said the voices, ringing in their ears, filled with hatred and despair. When she tried to flee with her children, Laura realized that the house would not let them leave. The doors slammed shut, the windows were tightly sealed, and echoes filled every corner. At that moment, the family understood the truth. The echoes were not only voices that responded to what they said, they were voices that revealed what had happened in the house, the sins committed by those who had lived there before. And now the family was caught in that same curse. Laura, in her desperation, tried to remember everything she had learned about the house, about the pact that had bound souls to those walls. But there was no way out. The voices increased in intensity, filling the house with a deafening roar. "They're here to stay," the final voice rang out, and with one last cry of terror, Laura and her family joined the echoes. The House of Echoes had claimed its last victim, and the voices continued to repeat their secrets, eternally trapped in the walls of that forgotten mansion. The cabin was located deep in a dense forest where the echo of the wind seemed to be silenced as it moved through the trees. No one bothered to come this way, and that was exactly what made the place ideal for the party they had planned. A group of friends, between laughter and jokes, had decided to get away from it all, disconnect from the noise of the city, and spend a weekend with friends. No one imagined that this choice would be the worst mistake of their lives. The cabin, although small and old, had something cozy about it. The wooden ceiling creaked under the weight of time, but the walls, though worn, seemed to have their own character. A place away from civilization, where they could do whatever they wanted without worrying about being disturbed. The arrival was simple. The car went up a steep dirt road, and when they finally arrived, they all went out in unison, eager to see the place. Laughter filled the air as they unloaded their suitcases and settled into the space. Night after night, the group became more and more relaxed. They talked about everything: old stories, anecdotes, rumors that were told about that part of the forest. But no one at the time stopped to think about the meaning of those stories. The idea that the place was marked by something strange, something they shouldn't have touched, was just superstition. That night, the temperature had dropped dramatically. The flames of the fire crackled, warming the central room where they stood. Candlelight flickered, creating shadows that danced against the walls, and laughter followed one after another, while the group played a board game without worrying about time. It was a typical winter night in the woods, but when the conversation began to wane, something in the air changed. The breeze that was once gentle transformed into a strange whisper, as if something was watching. They all felt it at the same time, like a chill running down their spine. "Did you hear that?" one of the girls asked, her voice hesitant. The others were silent, trying to catch that sound that had frozen their skin. A crunch, a whisper. Something was moving outside the cabin. "It's just the wind," one of the boys tried to reassure them, but his voice didn't sound convinced. Suddenly, the candles shook as if a gust of wind had touched them, but the windows were closed. In an instant, the darkness of the night grew denser, and the sound of the rustling branches intensified, as if the forest itself began to approach them. That's when something strange happened. The moon, which had previously been seen through the window, disappeared completely, plunging everything into impenetrable darkness. The hut, which until that moment seemed safe, now felt vulnerable, as if nature itself had ceased to protect it. "What happened to the moon?" asked a girl in a trembling voice, looking up at the sky. The darkness was so deep that not even the stars were visible. "It must be an eclipse," one of the boys suggested, but his tone didn't convince anyone. Something was not right. The feeling of being watched intensified, and a heavy weight seemed to have settled on his shoulders. The air began to grow colder, and the silence outside the cabin became deep, almost suffocating. In that silence, everyone could clearly hear their heartbeats racing and synchronized. "I'm going to look outside," said the most daring boy, Tomas. Although he wasn't entirely sure what he'd felt, something was pushing him out. Everyone fell silent as he made his way to the door, which creaked as it opened. The fog had begun to lift, darkening the surroundings even more. Thomas took a step out of the cabin, and the cold enveloped him immediately. The air was dense, as if the atmosphere itself were charged with a strange pressure. He looked up at the sky, but there was no moon, only a blackness so deep that it seemed to swallow everything in its path. He turned to return to the interior when suddenly he heard a whisper beside him. A low, distorted whisper, as if someone or something is calling him. He turned sharply but saw nothing. The fog enveloped him completely, making him feel trapped. "This is not right," he muttered to himself, hurrying back to the cabin. But just as he was about to take a step toward the door, he heard a low creak as if something was crawling behind him. "Thomas!" his friends shouted from inside. But he did not answer. The door closed by itself and silence returned to the cabin. No one dared to move, but their minds were filled with questions. What had happened to Thomas? At that moment, something slipped under the door, an almost imperceptible touch that only those closest to it could hear. It was as if a shadow without any form was lurking. The darkness wasn't just outside. Now something had infiltrated inside the cabin. In the distance, one of the boys, Lucas, tried to light a flashlight, but he couldn't get it to turn on. Somehow the darkness turned it off, absorbed any attempt at light. In the distance, at the edge of vision, something moved rapidly, and a piercing scream echoed from outside. Without thinking, the group got up and ran to the window. But when they looked, they saw nothing, only more darkness. Something was stalking them, something hiding in the shadows, waiting for the right moment to strike. But the worst was not what they could see. It was what they could not see. As the hours passed, the tension in the cabin increased. Fear took hold of each of them, and soon paranoia set in. No one wanted to be alone. No one dared to go out into the dark. They were trapped. Something was stalking them, and the moon, which no longer existed, had shown them the true face of that darkness that surrounded them. But no one yet knew what was stalking them or how they could escape. All they knew was that if they didn't find a solution soon, one by one they would disappear, swallowed by the same darkness that had surrounded them that moonless night. Since time immemorial, the small town of San Sebastian had lived under the shadow of a mysterious bell that could be heard in the distance. The bell, an ancient piece of bronze that hung atop the village church, had a sound that echoed through the mountains. It was not just any bell, its toll was heard in moments of great anguish, marking the proximity of death. As the years passed, the villagers began to get used to it, but they also learned to fear it. When the bell rang, someone was going to die, and everyone knew it. The sound was deep, heavy, as if the wind itself shrank in his presence. Some said that it was the voice of a soul trapped between two worlds, while others claimed that the bell was cursed, condemned to ring every time the life of an inhabitant was extinguished. The elders of the village remembered that it had been installed generations ago by a priest who disappeared without a trace. No one had ever managed to decipher the true origin of the bell. Everyone was afraid to approach her. The people had survived generations of suffering, always with the same curse lurking. The deaths came with the sound of the bell, which never failed, never stopped. In the darkness of the night, its sound penetrated the houses of the inhabitants, announcing the fate of some of them. Some tried to ignore it, but everyone knew that if the bell rang, death was near. On a stormy night, the sound of the bell was louder than ever. He struck with an intensity that seemed to reverberate in the bowels of the people. Each blow was a terrifying echo, echoing off the walls of the houses, shaking the hearts of the bravest. No one in the village had ever heard such a loud and ominous ringing. Anguish took hold of all who heard that sound, which reached the depths of their souls. But that night, there was someone who did not give in to fear. Alejandro, a brave young man determined to discover the truth behind the bell, decided to investigate. He had heard many stories and legends about his origin, but the need for answers had led him to challenge superstitions. As the storm raged, Alejandro left his house with a flashlight in hand. I knew something wasn't right, but I was willing to face the unknown. The streets of the town were deserted, the windows closed and the doors barred. The houses, normally full of life, had become mausoleums, all the inhabitants fearful of the bell. Alejandro walked through the deserted alleys, the wind whipping his face, but he did not hesitate. The church, which stood like a dark giant on the top of the hill, was waiting for him. I knew that there I would find the answer. The bell could not be the only mystery in that place. Something else was hidden. Something else was waiting to be revealed. As he ascended the steep path that led to the church, the fog thickened, enveloping everything around him. The light of the lantern trembled with every step he took, as if darkness were trying to swallow everything in its path. The sound of the bell kept ringing louder and louder, closer and closer. It was as if the bell itself was calling him, guiding him to his destination. When he reached the doors of the church, Alejandro felt a chill run down his spine. The doors, which had always been closed, were now ajar, as if they were waiting for him. Without thinking, he pushed the door hard, and as he crossed the threshold, the cold air enveloped him. The church, normally a place of peace, was now plunged into dense darkness. There was no light except for Alexander's lantern, which struggled to light the way. The sound of the bell seemed to come from deep within the church. Alexander walked slowly toward the altar, his footsteps echoing on the stone floor. As he advanced, the darkness seemed to take on a life of its own, as if shadows were watching his every move. The walls of the church rose like giants, and the roof seemed to crumble above his head. The figures carved into the stone, the statues of the saints, looked strange, deformed by the darkness. Finally, he reached the altar where the bell hung overhead just above a stone pedestal. It was huge, its size huge, and its presence overwhelming. There were no visible strings or mechanisms, and yet the bell kept ringing, non-stop. Alexander, paralyzed with terror, looked up at the altar and saw something that made him shudder. An old book, covered in dust and dark stains, rested on the pedestal. A pale glow emanated from its pages. With trembling hands, Alejandro brought the lantern closer to the book. When he opened it, a feeling of discomfort invaded him, as if the church itself breathed with him. The words of the book seemed to move, change, twist, as if the text were alive. And at that moment, a whispering voice echoed in his mind. "You have awakened what was asleep." The words floated in the air, and the sound of the bell increased in intensity, resounding in every corner of the church. The temperature dropped rapidly, and Alejandro felt a pressure in his chest, as if something invisible was crushing him. The book lit up with a sinister glow, and the shadows on the walls began to move, to lengthen, as if they were coming to life. In an instant, the altar was transformed. What was once a sacred space became a prison. A gigantic shadow emerged from the darkness, a spectral figure, his face diffuse but full of evil. His eyes flashed with a red light, as if he was looking through Alexander's soul. The figure approached slowly, floating in the air, and with each step it took, the bell rang louder as if its tolling marked the end of time. Alejandro tried to back up, but his legs did not respond. I was trapped, caught in the curse of the bell, caught in a cycle that would never end. The figure caught up with him, and an overwhelming cold came over him. The being spoke in a guttural whisper, words that Alejandro did not understand, but which resounded in his mind like a terrifying echo. "The town is scarred," said the shadow, his voice penetrating every corner of the church. "And you, Alejandro, have sealed your fate. They will all fall under the weight of the bell." It was a gray afternoon when Emily, exhausted from the long journey, decided to take an alternate route on her way home. The deserted road stretched for miles, surrounded by growing darkness. There were no signs of life or other vehicles, only the roar of the wind and the distant chirping of crickets. The engine of her car echoed in the stillness of the landscape, and she took the opportunity to relax. As she drove, she began to feel a strange sensation, as if she were being watched. She shook her head and told herself that it was just tiredness. However, something was not right. His phone above the passenger seat vibrated suddenly. Emily frowned at the screen. He didn't recognize the number, but decided to answer, hoping it was an important call. "Hello, who's talking?" she said in a tired voice, trying to sound calm. At first, there was no response, just the sound of heavy breathing on the other end of the line. Emily raised an eyebrow, puzzled. "Hello?" he repeated, looking at the phone with growing uneasiness. Finally, a trembling voice emerged from the darkness on the other end of the line. "Help me. Please," said the male voice, full of despair. "I'm trapped. I don't know where I am. There's something here. Something that is looking at me. He's chasing me." Emily felt a wave of discomfort run down her spine. The voice was distorted, as if the man was in a dark, terrifying place. "Who are you?" he asked, his pulse racing. Fear was beginning to creep into his voice. Before he could receive an answer, the call was abruptly cut off, leaving only the echo of the stranger's heavy breathing. Emily, her hands sweaty, looked at her phone for signs of life, but there was nothing. There were no messages, no missed call logs, just the blank screen. He stared at his phone for a few seconds, his mind racing for answers. Just a joke, he thought. It must be someone playing with me. However, a strange sensation lingered in the air. She decided to continue on her way, but she couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Over the next few days, Emily tried to forget what happened, blaming it on the stress and fatigue of the trip. However, something inside him told him not to ignore it. She was used to being alone on her travels, but she had never felt anything so unsettling. The latent sense of danger never went away. One night, after arriving at her apartment, Emily checked her phone and saw something that left her paralyzed. A message without a sender or any information. When he opened it, he saw a recording. She played it without knowing why, as if something pushed her to do it. The audio that began to play was the same as that of the mysterious call. The same desperate voice, the same gasping breath. But what made her tremble with terror wasn't just the voice. It was the sound of a whisper filtering through the end of the recording. Something enigmatic, almost inaudible, but clearly audible to anyone paying attention. "Don't look back," the whisper said like a warning. A shiver ran through his body. Suddenly he realized that there was something much more sinister behind that call. Something dark that was following her. But I couldn't let it go. I couldn't ignore it. He decided to investigate. However, I had no idea what I was about to discover. Emily began to go through her phone logs, looking for something that might lead her to understand what had happened on the road. When he accessed the call history, something strange happened. There on the list, he saw the call from the unknown number, but with a peculiar detail. The time she was received did not coincide with the time she had been behind the wheel. It was as if the call had been recorded long before she answered it. The mystery increased, but something worse awaited her. That same night, Emily began receiving text messages. They were short, meaningless, but chilling. "You're closer than you think," said the first. The following message came shortly after. "Don't leave the house." Another, an hour later. "Time is running out." The messages intensified as the days progressed. Emily couldn't ignore them. She began to feel like she was being watched constantly, even though there were no obvious signs that anyone was around. At all hours, I felt the presence of a shadow, something I couldn't see but that was always lurking. The situation escalated when, one morning, Emily woke up with the feeling that something was not right. The air was dense, as if the atmosphere itself were charged with electricity. When she got out of bed and looked out the window, she saw something that left her paralyzed. On the other side of the street, in the gloom, there was a figure. Tall, thin, motionless. A figure she couldn't identify, but who seemed to be staring at her. Panic took hold of Emily. He closed the curtains quickly, trying to calm himself. I needed to get out of there. He didn't know where he would go or what he would do, but he felt that his life was in danger. He picked up his phone and saw one more notification, a message with an attachment. The file was a photo taken from his own window, showing his figure looking out. The tall and slender figure was now closer. So close that I could see her eyes, which glowed in the dark. In a fit of desperation, Emily ran to her car and drove to the place where she had first received the call. The deserted road, now covered in a thick fog, seemed even more unsettling than before. When he arrived at the scene, he turned on the car's lights, looking for any sign of what had happened. There, in the darkness, he saw something on the ground. It was his phone. The phone I'd forgotten. The phone that had witnessed everything that had happened. Upon picking it up, the device turned on its own, and a new notification appeared. "You are too close to finding out the truth. Now there is no turning back." A heart-rending scream filled the air, and Emily felt something horrible loom over her. The phone began to make a strange sound, as if something was happening on the other end of the line. However, there was no one there. Everything was silent, except for the sound of his own breathing, quickened by fear. Emily tried to run, but the ground began to shake under her feet. At that moment, a dark figure emerged from the fog. It was the same being in the photo, his face deformed and his gaze fixed on her. She had no human face, only empty eyes that stared at her with terrifying intensity. The figure moved forward, sliding on the ground, and Emily, paralyzed with terror, tried to scream. But his voice did not come out. Only the sound of fog and heavy breathing surrounded her. The phone fell to the floor, and with it all hope. The figure caught up with her, and Emily disappeared into the darkness, absorbed in the terror that had haunted her from the moment she answered that call. The investigation that followed was puzzling. The phone, which was found at the scene, contained more messages. Some sent before Emily's disappearance, others after. The recordings and photos she had received indicated that someone had been following her from the moment she accepted that call. No one knew who was behind the threat, but the case remained unsolved. The authorities never found a concrete clue, and the forgotten phone remained stored as a macabre memory of the inexplicable. Emily's disappearance became a legend, a horror story whispered in the dark, where the forgotten phone was the key, and the figure in the fog, the eternal nightmare that haunted those naive enough to answer an unknown call. Night hung over the house with an eerie stillness, silence only interrupted by the occasional sound of a branch hitting the window. Laura was in her living room, embraced by the gloom that filtered through the curtains. The dim light of the table lamp dimly illuminated the book in his hands. In those moments of loneliness, I always found solace in the pages of a good novel, an escape from the daily grind. Tonight, however, something seemed different, something in the air that he couldn't clearly identify. The wall clock struck 9 and Laura heard a noise that broke the tranquility. A soft knock, as if someone were knocking on the door. He got up from the couch and walked toward the entrance, a slight feeling of discomfort running down his back. I never expected visitors at that time. He looked out the window before opening the door, but saw no one. A shiver ran through his body, though he tried to ignore it. After all, it could be children playing or someone in the wrong house. He opened the door and there he was, a man standing in his doorway. He had a serious appearance, with a dark jacket and a hat that partially covered his face. Laura stared at him, bewildered. She didn't recognize him, but there was something in his eyes that seemed strangely familiar. "Good evening," the man said in a deep but calm voice. "Laura, right?" Laura frowned, overwhelmed by a growing sense of unease. "Yes, but I don't know you. How do you know my name?" The man smiled slightly, but his smile didn't reach his eyes. "I told you, Laura. We know each other, even if you don't remember it." Laura blinked, confused. What was he talking about? She had never seen that man in her life. How could I meet her? The air in the room seemed to have become dense, as if the atmosphere itself was being charged with something indescribable. "I'm sorry, but I can't help you," Laura said, trying to remain calm as she took a step back. "I don't know you." The man stood there, motionless, watching her with an uncomfortable intensity. Without saying a word, his eyes flashed for a moment with a strange light. Laura, feeling the weight of the situation, tried to close the door. But before he could, the man stepped forward, preventing him from doing so. "You don't need to be nervous," she said with an eerie calm. "I just want to talk. It's important." Laura's heart began to pound. She didn't understand what was happening, but something inside her was telling her to be alert. The feeling of being watched intensified, and the house, which had once been her refuge, suddenly seemed like a strange alien place. "What do you want?" he asked in a thin voice, trying to stay in control. The man stared at her before answering. "Come with me. There are things you need to remember." A shiver ran down Laura's spine. What things should I remember? The feeling of fear invaded her completely, but at the same time she couldn't help but feel intrigued. Something about the way the man spoke made her feel like she couldn't just refuse him. "I'm going to call the police if you don't leave," he finally said, unable to hide the anxiety in his voice. But the man didn't seem to flinch at the threat. "You can do it if you prefer," he replied with unsettling calmness, "but it won't change anything." Laura felt a growing pressure in her chest. The need to understand what was happening prompted her to take a step back, reluctantly allowing her into her home. The man walked into the room with terrifying naturalness, as if he had been there thousands of times before. "I shouldn't have," Laura muttered to herself, though she knew it was too late. The door closed with a dull sound, and the house was filled with an ominous calm, as if time itself had stopped. The air seemed denser, and the darkness thicker. She sat down on the couch, unable to take her eyes off the man. He sat down in front of her, his arms folded, staring at her. "What I want you to remember is that," he finally said. "Remember what you forgot." Laura frowned, completely bewildered. "I don't understand what you're talking about. I don't know you. Who are you?" The man stared at her, and for an instant, Laura saw something in his eyes that made her blood run cold. It was as if there was a connection between them, something deep and ancient that I couldn't comprehend. The feeling of dread grew inside him. "I am someone from your past," he replied, his voice deeper. "Someone who knows you better than you think, and something you forgot comes looking for you." Laura didn't understand what was happening, but the man's words echoed in her mind. Something in his tone, in his gaze, caused a feeling of deep terror to take hold of her, a primitive fear, as if something that had been hidden for a long time was about to be revealed. "Leave me alone," he said, rising quickly from the couch. But when she turned to the door, a piercing cry stopped her. "You can't run away from who you are." The scream echoed throughout the house, and at that moment Laura felt as if the walls themselves were closing in on her. He looked at the man in horror, feeling the air grow even denser, as if his own breath was getting heavier and heavier. "What do you want from me?" he murmured. his voice trembling, unable to comprehend what was happening. The man slowly got up, approaching her unhurriedly, as if he knew there was no escape. "What I want you to remember is that you remember everything you have forgotten." Laura backed away, but the shadows of the house seemed to envelop her, barring any attempt to flee. His heart was pounding, and a cold sweat ran down his forehead. The man looked at her with that same frightful calmness, and at that moment, she understood something that made her blood run cold. She was no longer alone. The antique shop was hidden in a narrow, dusty street, almost impossible to find if you didn't know exactly where to look. The display cases were full of dusty objects, old and forgotten in appearance, which had survived the passage of time without being appreciated, destined to fall into the oblivion of future generations. However, in the midst of the darkness of that store, there was a piece that seemed to glow with a subtle yet unsettling glow. Gabriel, a young art collector, had come to the shop after hearing rumors about an old painting that was said to have an intriguing history. The owner of the shop, an older man with an enigmatic look, received him in silence and led him to the back, where, on an easel, was the painting that had attracted Gabriel's attention. It was a medium-sized painting, with a scene showing a family gathered around a table. The painting was beautiful, with impeccable technique, but there was something about people's faces that I couldn't decipher. Something in those empty eyes and that frozen expression troubled him deeply. The background was gloomy, as if a thick dark fog was sliding across the scene, enveloping everything in an air of despair. Gabriel couldn't help but feel a strange attraction to painting. Although his friends and colleagues at the art gallery warned him, something inside him told him that the piece should be his. The price asked by the old owner seemed derisory for a work of such quality, and despite the old man's non-verbal warning, Gabriel did not hesitate to make the purchase. Once at home, the painting was carefully placed on the main wall of the living room, right in front of the fireplace. That same night after dinner, Gabriel sat in front of the painting, observing the details, trying to understand what made the work unsettling about it. The image attracted him, enveloped him, as if the painted figures were trying to speak to him, to call him to something beyond the canvas. The first change occurred during the early morning, when moonlight filtered through the windows and reflected on the canvas. Gabriel, still awake, stood up at the sound of a slight creak, as if the painting itself were moving. He looked up at the wall where the paint seemed to have changed slightly. The figures in the painting were no longer in the same posture. The woman who was sitting on the right of the table, smiling at the painting, now seemed to be staring at Gabriel. His eyes had become darker, deeper, as if that woman's gaze was watching him directly through the painting. A shiver ran down Gabriel's spine. He tried to rationalize what he had seen, thinking that perhaps the light and shadow played tricks on his eyes. But as the days went by, the alterations in the painting became more noticeable. Every night the scene was modified, albeit in a subtle way. The faces in the painting were beginning to show more distressed expressions. The figure of the man in the center, which at first seemed a reassuring figure, began to distort. His face lengthened, as if the painting were taking on a life of its own. Gabriel began to notice that, even though the figures seemed inert during the day, every time he turned off the lights, the eyes of the characters in the painting seemed to move towards him. One night, while studying the painting, something even stranger happened. The scene was completely altered. The painting family was no longer gathered around the table. Instead, the characters seemed to be facing each other, their faces disfigured by terror. The man in the center of the table seemed to be screaming, but he made no sound. The figures were surrounded by a thick fog, as if the painting itself was being swallowed by something dark and ominous. Gabriel felt trapped in a nightmare. He began to see shadowy figures reflected on the surface of the canvas. I couldn't take my eyes off the painting, but at the same time I felt a growing sense of anguish. He decided to research the history of the painting, looking for any clue as to its origin. However, what he found only plunged him further into mystery. There were no records of that work, nor of the family portrayed in it. The only thing he could find was a hidden note on the back of the painting that read, "Darkness takes away what it touches." This note, written in an ancient calligraphy, appeared to be marked with a red stain, as if it were blood. One afternoon, when returning from work, Gabriel found the painting completely changed. The scene had advanced. Now it showed the characters in what seemed an even more disturbing scenario. A fire was burning behind the family, consuming the scene in total chaos. The woman's figure, which at first seemed to be the calmer figure, was now wide-eyed, her hands raised as if trying to scream, but not audibly. Gabriel was indescribably attracted to painting, but at the same time an unbearable terror seized him. One night, as I was looking at the painting through a dim light, something worse happened. The figures began to move in the painting. The woman on the right, the one who originally looked so calm, slowly raised her hand to the surface of the painting. Gabriel took a step back, trembling. A shrill scream echoed through his head, a sound of despair and pain. Suddenly, the woman's figure began to slowly fade away, as if she was being absorbed by the fire at the bottom. Every time I looked at the painting, something else changed, something creepier. The characters were no longer only horrified, but seemed to be suffering, as if the painting was taking their lives. Gabriel began to feel a presence, something that slipped behind him, watching him as he looked at the painting. I couldn't escape that feeling that I wasn't alone. Then something even more terrifying happened. During one of his sleepless nights, Gabriel woke up with a feeling of tightness in his chest. He looked at the painting and saw something he had never imagined. One of the figures in the painting, the man sitting at the table, had disappeared. Instead, he was himself staring from the canvas. The painting had captured him. Terror seized him. Gabriel tried to move away, but his eyes could not stop looking at the painting. The man in the painting, now with his face distorted, began to slowly move towards the edge of the painting, as if he was trying to break through the canvas. Gabriel jumped up, but the figures began to lengthen and twist, emitting whispers that echoed in his mind. The worst of all was when one of the figures began to call him by his name. Gabriel heard clearly the whisper of his own voice emerging from the painting. "Gabriel, come here." The feeling of despair completely invaded him. His mind became cloudy, and fear consumed him. He ran to the door, but when he tried to open it, the painting seemed to come to life. His eyes full of terror looked at him, and he felt that he was being pursued. The figure of the man in the painting, now with a macabre grin, began to stretch towards him, as if trying to reach for him. Gabriel could not escape that oppressive atmosphere. The man in the painting drew nearer and nearer until, with a last cry, he disappeared from the canvas, leaving only the dense fog that enveloped the scene. Suddenly, everything in the room went dark. Painting was no longer just an image on the canvas. Gabriel could no longer distinguish between the real world and the painting, as if the painting had completely absorbed him. Fear, terror, and despair surrounded him, as he watched the scene of the painting slowly unravel, taking with it the only reality he knew. The painting had served its purpose. Each night, the city fell into a deep, dark silence, as if time itself stood still. The moonlight barely made it through the heavy clouds that crept across the sky. It was an oppressive stillness, interrupted only by the sudden roar of the storm that began promptly at midnight. No one in the city knew where it came from, but everyone knew its destructive power. Every time he started, the city trembled as if it was under the control of a force beyond his comprehension. The storm brought with it not only the torrential rain and the fierce wind, but something much more terrifying. When thunder echoed in the sky, so did whispers. Whispers that seemed to come from the shadows, floating through the trees, sneaking through the windows, whispering things that only you knew. Secrets, fears, forgotten desires. Everything you had tried to hide over the years was revealed in those dark moments, as if the storm was drawn from your worst nightmares. The first to notice the storm were the most vulnerable, children. They woke up in the middle of the night, sweaty and scared, with the echo of strange voices floating in their heads. Many said that the storm spoke to them, that they saw dark figures moving through the rain. The shadows that emerged from the drops seemed more human than spectral. Some even swore that the figures stared at them from the other side of the windows, their eyes as empty as the abyss itself. As the storm raged, its effects spread beyond the minds of children. No one was safe. Adults were beginning to lose their sanity. The city, which once seemed to be at peace, was transformed into a place full of murmurs and disturbing whispers. The empty streets were not enough to avoid the feeling of being followed, of being observed. No one could sleep, but no one dared to talk about what was happening. The terror was so deep that even the words felt dangerous, as if talking about the storm brought with it an even worse curse. Of all the people affected, the one who was most affected by the storm was Clara, a young woman who had lived in the city all her life. Clara was strong, skeptical, and had always thought that fear was just a construct of the human mind. But one night, as the clock struck 12 and the storm began to break out, Clara felt for the first time a chill run down her spine. She was alone in her house. The sound of rain beating against the windows was all she could hear, but then the whisper came. First, a faint, barely audible murmur, as if someone were in the same room as her. Clara looked around, but the house was empty. There was nothing and no one. However, the whisper persisted. It slipped into his ears, whispering something he couldn't understand. Each time I tried to block out the sound, it got louder. "Clara," murmured the voice, this time clearer. His own name, whispered by someone he couldn't see. Panic began to grow inside her. Her breathing became erratic and her heart was pounding. He looked out the window, looking for any signs that might make sense of what he felt. But there was nothing, only darkness and rain. Still, I knew something else was going on. Something dark. Something that had been haunting the city for years, and now it had reached it. The storm brought not only rain and wind, but something far worse. An ancient force that had been patiently waiting for the right moment to manifest. Over the next few weeks, the storm continued to batter the city each night, bringing with it more mysterious figures. Some of them seemed to be people Clara knew, but their behavior was strange and erratic. Sometimes the figures appeared in the streets, other times in her dreams, always empty-eyed and smiles twisted, staring at her, waiting for her to recognize them. The shadows lengthened and the voices multiplied. Clara no longer knew if she was awake or dreaming, if the storm was really there or if her mind was falling apart. Panic soon took over the city. People began fleeing their homes, seeking shelter in places far from the storm. But wherever they went, the storm followed them. No one was safe. The streets were filled with shadows, with figures that seemed to belong to another world. But the worst thing was that those figures were not strangers. The voices whispering in the darkness were of acquaintances, of loved ones, of those who had once stood by them and who were now nothing more than echoes of a past life. Desperation took hold of the city's inhabitants, but there was no escape. There was no end to the storm, and its effects were becoming more and more terrifying. Houses began to collapse, lights suddenly went out, and dark figures became more aggressive. Some tried to resist, clinging to the hope that it would all end at dawn. But that hope was quickly extinguished. Clara, now on the verge of madness, decided to face the storm once and for all. She knew that something in her was calling her, that the storm was not a simple weather manifestation. It was something much deeper, something that had been waiting for someone to confront it. The only way to end all that, Clara thought, was to face the darkness itself. So on a moonless night, he plucked up the courage and took to the streets of the city. The rain was pounding furiously and the wind seemed to rip everything in its path. But Clara did not hesitate. She advanced through the deserted streets, guided only by the echo of her own fear. That's when she saw it. In the center of the city, where the shadows seemed denser, a figure emerged from the darkness. A tall figure wrapped in a black cloak that floated around him as if the air itself feared him. Clara didn't know if she was seeing a person or an entity, but something inside her knew that figure was the key. The figure slowly approached, and as it did, the voices grew louder. "Clara, come," whispered the shadows, getting closer and closer. "Come and know your destiny." The figure stopped in front of Clara, and at that moment his face appeared. It wasn't human, but it wasn't something Clara could understand either. It was a face formed by darkness itself, a mask that was constantly changing, absorbing everything it touched. "We've been waiting for you," the figure said in a tone that echoed in his mind. "The storm is just the beginning. Your soul is scarred, Clara. And now, at last, you will be a part of this eternal place. Come to us." Clara, with terror taking over her body, took a step back. Shadows surrounded her, and mysterious figures began to emerge from all sides. Murmurs filled the air, and the figure in front of her stretched out a hand towards her. I knew I couldn't escape. Panic paralyzed her, and in that instant she realized that the storm was not a natural force, but something far more sinister. She had been summoned by something dark, and no matter how strong her will was, it was too late. The city, the storm, the shadows, all came together in one point, and Clara faded into the darkness, becoming one of the figures who roamed the streets every night, trapped in an eternal cycle of terror. The midnight storm never stopped. After years immersed in the emptiness of loneliness, a man finds himself trapped in a cycle of anguish and silence that seems eternal. The house, an old and gloomy building, has been his only refuge, but it soon becomes his worst prison. The walls that had given him shelter become a constant threat, full of murmurs and whispers that grow with each passing day. As the nights lengthen and darkness takes over every corner of the house, the feeling of being watched intensifies. What starts as simple noises from the old house, the creaking of the woods, the hum of the pipes, turns into something much more disturbing. Man, who has lived for years apart from the world, begins to hear a voice. It's low and whispering, almost inaudible, but enough to chill the blood of anyone in its place. At first, he convinces himself that he is imagining things. Loneliness is driving him crazy. After all, I've never experienced anything like it before, but the voice doesn't stop. It doesn't matter how hard you try to ignore it, how loud the music is, or how tight you keep the windows. The whispers come in clearer and clearer, until finally they are heard as if they were a palpable presence, nestled within the very walls of the house. Those whispers don't seem to have an end. They seem to come from the cracks, from the inside of the rotting wood, from the very earth on which the house was built. Every word she hears seems like a heavy burden settling on her mind, bringing with it painful memories she had buried years ago, memories she refuses to remember, but which the voice seems to uncover around her. As the days go by, the house becomes more claustrophobic. The walls, which once offered her a refuge, now feel like a trap. The voice, now clearer and full of despair, constantly stalks him. He speaks of dark secrets that he himself had forgotten, of events that he had deeply repressed. He remembers his mother's blank look when she left him at the door of his grandparents' house, the days they spent not knowing if he would ever see her again, the voices whispering about family betrayals and secrets that should never have come to light. The tension grows, and the man begins to feel harassed not only by the voices, but also by the atmosphere that surrounds him. The shadows seem to move on their own, and the lights in the house flicker for no apparent reason. The air becomes dense, as if the house itself were alive, breathing with it, waiting for something. The anxiety grows as the voices become clearer, more urgent, as if each word is a dagger piercing his soul. On one of the darkest nights, when the clock strikes the time when everything seems to be at its lowest, the voices finally reveal the source of their suffering. They are not simple echoes of the past. They are not simple forgotten memories. They are the voices of those he has wronged, people he has abandoned, betrayed, and left behind in his lonely life. They are the echoes of a conscience that does not let him rest, the whispers of a life that he himself destroyed without being aware of what he was doing. It is at that moment, when despair consumes him completely, that the walls begin to move. The first thing he notices is the deep, deafening creak, as if the very structure of the house is yielding under the weight of the secrets it holds. The walls, once solid and cold, are now deformed, as if the house is responding to the voices that filter through the cracks. The figure that materializes before him is blurred, incomplete, like a shadow that still struggles to take shape. But he is not a figure who inspires peace. His eyes, empty and dark, seem to look directly into his soul, stripping him naked. The creature, an amalgam of shadows and repressed memories, slowly approaches, its footsteps barely audible but unmistakable. The man wants to scream, but his lips do not respond. He wants to run away, but his legs won't move. He is trapped, surrounded by the presence of those he has failed. The creature speaks, and its voice is a mixture of the whispers and cries of the past. It is a voice that takes his breath away, that fills him with a terror so deep that he feels that he is going to faint at any moment. He speaks to him of guilt, of the crimes he has committed in the name of indifference and loneliness. It reminds him of his lies, his broken promises, and the empty life he has chosen to live. Every word is a weight on your chest, every breath an effort to stay conscious. The darkness in the house seems to be denser now, as if the house itself is devouring the light, dragging the man into the deepest darkness. Memories of his mother, of his abandonment, of his lost childhood, strike him with such brutal force that he feels like he's falling apart. But he can't move. He can't escape. The creature shows him the scene he had never wanted to remember. He, as a child, looking out the window as his mother walks away with a sad smile on her face. There are no words between them, only a void that stretches between them, an abyss of silence that he could never fill. The figure stops right in front of him, and in an almost imperceptible whisper says, "It's your fault, this is all your fault." It is at that moment, when despair completely consumes him, that the man finally falls to the ground. his hands trembling as they cling to the weathered wood. Panic engulfs him, terror consumes him, and the truth finally hits him with full force. He can't escape his past. He can't escape the people he's left behind, the lives he's destroyed. The house, which was once his refuge, is now his grave. Man finds himself alone, surrounded by the shadows of the past, the echoes of those he has failed. The creature vanished, but its presence remains dormant, like a mark that follows it through the darkness. The walls, which were once the barriers of his solitary life, are now the bars of his condemnation. Finally, the house begins to creak, the sound ringing in her ears as the walls crumble around her. Darkness envelops him completely, and silence consumes him. Man will never be alone again, but the company he has now is that of his own demons, and there is no escape. The voice, the creature, the house, everything merges into an endless nightmare. Panic consumes him completely, and in the ultimate darkness, man finally understands what he has lost. And that's when the final whisper rings in his ears, a lament that will follow him for all eternity. The Fernandez family had been looking for the perfect house for months, a spacious home in a place away from the noise of the city, surrounded by nature. When they finally found the ancient mansion, located deep in the forest, they couldn't believe their luck. Despite the somewhat worn appearance, the price was unbeatable. Who else would want to live in such an isolated place? The mansion, with its solid wood doors, high windows, and glass ceilings, looked like something out of another time. The place, although somewhat dark and covered in moss, had an elegance that immediately captivated them. As they walked through its corridors, the family felt that they were entering an old tale. There was something mysterious about its walls, as if every corner kept a hidden history, something they didn't dare to ask. The silence in the house was almost palpable, as if the whole place breathed in a deep, ancient way. Within days of moving, strange things began to happen. The youngest daughter, Clara, was the first to notice something strange. One afternoon, as he explored the second floor, he heard a distant echo, as if someone had whispered his name from deep within the house. At first she thought her mind was playing tricks on her, but when she told her parents, they took her as a joke. However, Clara could not shake the feeling that the house was talking to her, as if it were alive. One night, after a quiet dinner, the echoes grew stronger. Clara, unable to sleep, got up in the middle of the night and went to the main living room, where the fireplace no longer crackled, and the moonlight barely filtered through the curtains. As he walked down the dark hall, he suddenly heard his mother's voice clearly. It was a trembling whisper, calling to her from the back of the house. He ran to the place where the voice came from, but when he arrived, he found everything silent. His mother slept soundly in her room, oblivious to any disturbance. Clara, terrified, began to doubt what she had heard, but the fear in her chest was real. He decided to tell his parents everything the next morning. The family tried to rationalize the strange events. The father, Luis, thought that perhaps the isolation of the house was affecting everyone's mind, but when one night, after a particularly hot day, the house began to creak, terror took hold of them. The sound came from the walls. At first it was just a soft crack, but then it morphed into an increasingly loud and sinister sound. It was as if something was pushing the walls from within. One night, as everyone was trying to sleep, the echoes began to resonate louder than ever. Luis woke up with a start and went out into the hallway, where he discovered that the house was full of echoes, but they were not common voices. It seemed as if someone was whispering incomplete sentences, unintelligible words, as if the walls were repeating the secrets of the former owners. The echoes became clearer and clearer, and began to form words that, although incomplete, gave a feeling of indescribable discomfort. Luis, restless, began to investigate the history of the mansion. He found that the previous family had lived there for generations, but what surprised him most was the fact that none of them had survived the house. They had all moved, but something had forced them back, something dark and persistent. No one had ever grown old living in that house. Each member of the family had died young, mysteriously. The house seemed to devour the lives of those who dared to inhabit it. Luis began to suspect that the echoes they heard were not just sounds from the past, but were the voices of those who had lived and died in the mansion. The walls not only whispered their secrets, they retained them. There was something evil about that place, something that trapped souls and held them prisoner. One night, Clara couldn't take it anymore. She ran out of her room, disoriented, as if she were being called by something invisible. She ran through the halls, the echoes following her, calling her name over and over again. When he reached the main hall, he stopped in his tracks. In front of her, in the mirror on the wall, she saw a figure. It was his mother, but his eyes were empty, hollow, as if the woman he saw was but a shadow of his former self. The figure smiled in a strange, twisted way, while his lips formed words that Clara could not understand. Terror invaded her, but she could not move, as if the house had trapped her in that very place. In the distance, the echoes began to rise, louder, clearer, until they became desperate cries. They were the voices of the former inhabitants of the mansion, calling for help, warning that it was too late. Luis came running to the classroom when he heard Clara's scream, but what he found left him paralyzed. There was no trace of her. Only the resounding echo of his name remained, repeating itself on the walls. In desperation, Luis tried to call the police, but in doing so, he discovered that the phone lines in the house were cut. No one outside that place could hear them. The family realized they were no longer alone. Something dark had awakened in the mansion, something that was not only watching them but was slowly devouring them. No one could escape the echoes that filled the house, which resounded louder and louder, like a sentence that never ended. As the weeks passed, the family began to fall apart. The echoes not only caught their voices but also their minds. Their memories became distorted. Their emotions became erratic. Luis began to lose his sense of reality, and his wife, Anna, seemed to become more and more distant, as if trapped in an endless dream. Clara, for her part, did not stop listening to her mother's voice calling her, urging her to join her in a world where the limits of life and death did not exist. Finally, on a particularly dark night, the echoes peaked. The house itself seemed to breathe, and the shadows on the walls began to take shape. The former residents of the mansion materialized before them, and as their screams echoed through the air, the Fernandez family finally understood what it meant to live in that house. It wasn't just a home, it was a prison with no way out, where trapped souls would never stop suffering. The family, already consumed by terror, never managed to escape. At the dawn of a day that never came, the mansion was empty again, but the echoes continued to resound like a warning to those who dared to approach. The house of the echoes finally had claimed its last victim. The scene in front of him crumbled into chaos. The earth began to tremble and the air became dense, as if an invisible force imprisoned it. The figure in the clearing dissolved, and the shadows of the trees began to twist, growing towards him. The ground split, and what seemed like an unbreakable peace turned into a nightmare of horror and despair. Marcos tried to run, but each step he took plunged him deeper into darkness. The bloody footprint, like a threat from the unknown, haunted him. Every time he turned, he saw the distortions in the air, the symbols gliding over the ground. The trees seemed to move, as if they were part of a sentient entity, watching him, stalking. The horror reached its peak when it reached the edge of a precipice. The forest seemed to have engulfed him, and all that remained was emptiness. The bloody footprint was there on the edge of the abyss, and Mark, now completely plunged into terror, saw a figure emerge from the shadows, his own reflection distorted, grotesque, standing in front of him. And then, as if all the accumulated terror had only one purpose, the footprint began to drag him away. A violent tug pushed him into the abyss, into the void, as the shadows devoured him completely. The man disappeared into the darkness of the forest, and the man, the bloody one, as if it had never existed, vanished into the earth. The echo of his cry echoed in the distance, but no one heard him. The forest, again in silence, kept the last vestige of its passage, until another visitor arrived, unwary to follow the trail of the bloody track. The rain was pouring down on the small town. An icy wind whipped through the windows of the car while Lara watched through the foggy glass. He had traveled hundreds of miles to get there, following the clues his mother had left him in an old letter. In it, he told her about the cabin in which he had grown up, a place that seemed to be shrouded in mystery and darkness. Lara had never met her grandmother, and her mother never spoke of her, but there was something about the tone of the letter that had intrigued her, a kind of call she couldn't ignore. The car stopped in front of the cottage's entrance, an old building surrounded by twisted trees that seemed to whisper to each other. Lara took a deep breath before getting out of the vehicle, feeling the humidity of the night take over her skin. As he approached the door of the cabin, the air became heavier, as if the place was waiting for something. He entered the cabin, and the first shiver ran down his spine. The air was stale, permeated with a smell of old wood and dampness. The dim light of an oil lamp illuminated the walls, covered in dust and cobwebs. The wooden beams creaked softly, as if the place breathed on its own. Lara watched every corner cautiously, her mind filled with unanswered questions. At first, everything seemed calm. He decided to explore, looking for some clues about his family's history. He had heard rumors that the hut had been built on ancestral land, but the details were vague and fuzzy. As he walked through the halls, something caught his attention. A small wooden door at the back of the house, barely visible in the shadows. Without thinking, he approached and opened it. On the other side, he found a staircase that descended into a dark, damp basement. At that moment, a strange echo echoed through the hut, a low murmur that seemed to come from the walls themselves. Lara stopped, her eyes widening in surprise. Was there anyone else in the cabin? The echo seemed to call out to her, as if someone was whispering her name, but when she looked around, the house was empty. A shiver ran through her body, but she decided to go downstairs. Driven by a curiosity she couldn't resist. The basement was dark and cold. The light from the lamp barely shone a few feet in front of her. Lara moved slowly, the echo of her own footsteps echoing in the empty space. In the background, something glowed faintly, something that appeared to be an old, dust-covered object. He approached cautiously, and when he picked it up, he found a wooden box, old and worn, with intricate engravings on its surface. Unable to help it, Lara opened the box, and inside she found letters, photographs, and other personal belongings. As he flipped through the papers, an icy wind suddenly picked up, extinguishing the oil lamp. Darkness enveloped everything, and Lara stood still, feeling an invisible pressure begin to envelop her. It was then that she heard the first whisper clearly. "Lara?" The voice was distant but terrifying, a low wail that seemed to come from the walls themselves, as if something was trying to communicate with her. Lara recoiled instinctively, tripping over an old chair that fell to the floor with a deafening noise. Instantly, the house seemed to come to life. The echoes multiplied, the voices intertwined, calling her, shouting her name. He covered his ears with his hands, but he couldn't block out the sound. Suddenly, the atmosphere changed. The air became thicker, denser, as if something was filling the space with a palpable presence. The murmur morphed into a deep, distorted voice that echoed in his ears. "Get out!" the voice commanded. But Lara couldn't move. I was paralyzed, trapped in the darkness of that basement, surrounded by echoes that never ended. At that moment, something moved in the corner of the room, a shadow that seemed to slip between the walls. Lara turned quickly, but there was nothing there. He couldn't explain it, but something told him that he shouldn't stay in that place. The feeling of being watched intensified, as if the eyes of countless unseen presences were fixed on her. Her breathing quickened and panic began to take hold of her. Suddenly, a clanging noise cut through the air. The basement door slammed shut. Lara jumped, but the pressure in the air did not disappear. A shiver ran through her body as she realized she was trapped. What had started as a visit to the cabin to discover his family's history had turned into a nightmare. Something dark and evil was present in the house, something that had been waiting for his arrival. Desperate, she began to look for a way out. He knocked on the walls, tried to open the door, but it was all useless. The presence in the house became stronger, more aggressive. The echoes of the voices turned into deafening screams, and the shadowy figure she had seen in the corner of the basement was now closer, getting closer and closer to her. Lara spun quickly, but the shadow faded before she could see her clearly. It was then that a figure appeared in front of her, emerging from the darkness. A man with a pale face and empty eyes was staring at her. Lara tried to scream, but her voice trailed off in her throat, gripped by terror. The figure wasn't moving, but his eyes reflected an endless emptiness, as if his soul had been ripped out and replaced by something much darker. The figure began to speak in a language Lara couldn't understand, but the sense of horror grew with each word she uttered. It was as if the figure was communicating with her through more than just words, as if it was touching her mind, penetrating her deepest thoughts. "Get out," the figure whispered, but Lara couldn't move a single muscle. The presence around her became denser, as if the hut itself were alive, breathing with her. Panic overflowed in her mind, but Lara couldn't do anything. The darkness seemed to swallow everything, and the echoes of the voices were intertwined with his own thoughts. "I don't want to die here," he thought, but it was useless. The figure stepped forward, and Lara felt an unbearable pressure in her chest. Her mind was filled with distorted images, memories of her family's past, fragments of voices and laughter that mingled with the screams that now surrounded her. The ground beneath his feet began to shake. The echoes became louder, more aggressive, as if the house itself was reacting to their presence. Lara fought to free herself, but the voices pushed her into the abyss. A sinister laugh rang in her ear, and as she turned, she saw a gigantic shadow sliding towards her. At that moment, the house seemed to explode in a burst of terror. The walls creaked, the windows shattered, and the figure in front of her disappeared in a flash of darkness. Lara fell to the ground, exhausted, struggling to breathe. But something inside him knew that he had won. It had survived the echo of the past. The dense air inside the cave felt even heavier with the rustling of rocks falling around it. The hikers had barely had time to react before the ground crumbled beneath their feet, falling into a dark, cold darkness. When at last the noise of the rocks died down, they found themselves in a vast subterranean space with the walls of the cave extending upwards like gigantic pillars, and the ceiling seemingly so high that the human eye could not see the end. However, the most frightening thing of all was the silence. A silence so dense and crushing that it seemed to devour every sound, every whisper, every breath. They had come with the intention of exploring, but now they were trapped, with no way of knowing if there was a way out, or if they would ever see the light of day again. Their lanterns flickered faintly in the darkness, as if the shadows themselves wanted to take hold of them. Dust-covered bodies with some superficial wounds from falls were trying to gather around a small illuminated area. Mark, the leader of the group, was the first to react, looking up at the cave walls for any sign of a way out. His breathing was rapid, his mind trying to process what had happened. Was there a way to escape? There didn't seem to be a clear path, just the cold, rocky walls that surrounded them. Emma, his longtime companion, came up to him, her face pale and full of fear. She didn't say anything, just held onto his arm tightly. "We have to look for a way out. This can't be the only thing," Mark said, his voice trembling but determined. The group, which had arrived as a simple excursion, was now caught up in something much more terrifying. Every step they took seemed to bring them closer to an even deeper abyss, an abyss in which not only physical darkness enveloped them, but also the anguish and despair that began to take hold of them. In the midst of the chaos and bewilderment, suddenly, something changed. Faint whispers, barely audible, began to fill the air. The group members stopped, their hearts pounding. The whispers were empty, as if coming from the very walls of the cave. There was no clear source, but everyone could feel them, like a presence moving, waiting. Fear began to grow within them, like a tangible presence surrounding them. "You heard that, didn't you?" asked Liam, one of the younger hikers, looking around with eyes full of dread. No one answered. Everyone was listening, but the silence remained like a veil over them, increasing the feeling that someone was watching them. "We must keep walking," Mark said finally, his voice breaking but firm. "Maybe we can find a way out if we keep moving forward." He tried to restore the calm that everyone was beginning to lose, but deep down, he knew that anxiety was consuming him as much as everyone else. With slow steps, the group moved forward, their flashlights illuminating the contours of the walls. The sound of his footsteps echoed through the vastness of the cave, as if the echo of each movement multiplied, amplified by the darkness. The air grew denser with each passing second, and the feeling of being watched only intensified. They spent what seemed like hours walking in circles, but no matter how far they went, they couldn't find a way out. Each turn led them to a new fork in the underground labyrinth, but none seemed to lead to anything more than a new darkness, deeper and more unnerving than the last. The fear was accumulating like a constant pressure on her breasts. The flashlights began to flicker, as if the batteries were running low, but everyone knew that was impossible. They had checked the flashlights before entering. Something was interfering with the energy that fed them, and then they saw it. At the end of a corridor, just at the edge of the lantern light, a figure appeared, tall, thin, and shrouded in shadows. Although they couldn't see him clearly, something in his presence was unmistakable. He wasn't human, not completely. His movements were slow but calculated, as if he were in no hurry. His figure seemed to merge with the darkness, and despite being several meters away from them, everyone felt a chill run down their spine. It was as if his very presence was filtering the air, invading the space with a fear so palpable that it was difficult to breathe. "What's that?" asked Emma, her voice almost a whisper, afraid that the walls themselves might hear her. The figure did not respond, but his presence was enough to make each member of the group paralyzed. No one moved. No one spoke. Only the sound of his heavy breaths filled the air. Something inside them was telling them that if they got any closer, if they tried to move a single muscle, something terrible would happen. Suddenly, the figure moved towards them, slowly moving forward, its face never fully visible. Each step seemed to increase the weight of the fear that enveloped them. The tension in the air became unbearable, as if everything was about to break. Mark, fighting the terror that paralyzed him, took a step back, trying to get away from the figure, but something stopped him. An invisible force seemed to press on his chest, preventing him from moving. "We can't stay here," shouted Liam, but his voice was filled with panic and despair. He tried to run, but his legs didn't respond, as if the ground itself had become unforgiving, unable to support his weight. The figure was getting closer, and now Mark could see something that made his blood run cold. Instead of a human face, what he saw was a void, an abyss in the place of the eyes, where there was only darkness. The figure began to speak, but his words were incomprehensible, swept away by a distant echo that seemed to come from everywhere. "This is the end," the figure whispered, his voice echoing in their minds. "There is no escape from the abyss. This is where it all ends." Terror seized them in an instant. There was no way out, there was no hope. The abyss had claimed those who had tried to escape. Suddenly, the ground beneath his feet began to shake violently, and the echo of a distant scream, filled with despair and pain, echoed through the walls of the cave. The figure began to fade into the darkness, but his laughter, filled with mockery and emptiness, continued to reverberate in the ears of the hikers. The last memories they had before succumbing to the abyss were the laughter and muffled screams, and the sound of rocks falling on them, as if the cave itself was closing its doors forever. The guardian of the abyss had served his purpose, and with his last laugh, the group of hikers disappeared, forever trapped in the endless darkness. There was something about the old university that had always troubled Javier. It was a place steeped in history, where the corridors stretched as if they had no end, and the walls whispered forgotten secrets. He had studied there for years, but he had always felt that something strange was hiding behind its ancient walls, something that could not be seen, but could be perceived. His curiosity as a student of history had led him to investigate every corner of that building. However, what he would discover that afternoon would change his life forever. Javier had been trapped in the library until late, as he often did when he couldn't stop studying. He was reviewing some old documents on the history of the university when, among the dusty pages of an old book, something fell to the floor. He bent down to pick it up and found a small key, made of a strange, opaque, almost black metal. It was heavy in his hands, and the feeling it conveyed was not of something ordinary. A strange feeling of uneasiness took hold of his body, a pressure in his chest that he could not explain. Despite the strange vibration emitted by the key, his curiosity got the better of him. He decided to keep it in his backpack, not knowing what connection it would have with what he was about to experience. That night, as he was returning to his room, Javier passed near a corridor that had always seemed desolate and gloomy to him. It was located in an old wing of the university that was rarely visited by students. The hallway was dimly lit by warm light lamps that created eerie shadows on the stone walls. At first, he didn't pay much attention to it, but something stopped him. He looked at a door at the end of the hall, a door he had never noticed before. She was almost hidden by a heavy curtain that fell to the floor, and the key in her hand seemed to whisper to her. He felt he had to get closer. The air was thick and cold as Javier approached the door. He didn't know why, but he felt like his heart was beating faster. With a trembling hand, he took the key out of his backpack and inserted it into the lock. The door opened with a dull creak as if it had been closed for centuries. The room beyond was plunged into darkness, but a strange energy emanated from it. Javier took a step inside, and instantly the atmosphere seemed to become heavier, as if the atmosphere was impregnated with something old and forgotten. A strange echo echoed in his ears, as if someone or something was watching him from the darkness. The feeling of being watched grew, and Javier felt that something was not right. His breathing quickened. Then, in the midst of the gloom, something moved. Soft steps, almost imperceptible, but close enough to make his skin stand on end. Javier turned, looking for the source of that noise, but he saw nothing. The door closed behind him with a thud that made him jump with a start. Instantly, a shudder ran through his body. What he saw next was a vision he could never erase from his mind. An endless corridor stretched out before him, so dark that it seemed to devour the light. However, there was something else, something I couldn't comprehend. The shadows moved, stretched, and shrank around them as if they had a life of their own. The air became even denser and the silence became unbearable. Then, from the depths of darkness, a voice whispered his name. It wasn't a human voice, nor was it a familiar whisper. It was an unnatural, guttural murmur that seemed to come from the walls themselves. Javier. The voice not only called him by name, but spoke to his soul, filling it with indescribable terror. The shadows began to move more quickly as if attracted by his presence. Javier felt that something was stalking him, that he was not alone, and at that moment a shiver ran down his spine. A sound, similar to a heavy sigh, slid through the walls, getting closer with every breath I took. At first, Javier thought it was his imagination, a simple illusion created by the darkness of the corridor. But then, a dark shadow, denser than the void itself, materialized before him. It was the form of a human being, but its eyes shone with an unearthly empty light, as if there was no life inside. The figure did not walk. It floated, gliding on the ground with a spectral grace. Javier tried to back away, but his feet seemed to be glued to the ground, as if the corridor itself was holding him back. The figure began to slowly approach, and Javier could hear the cracking of his own bones as he tried to move. The shadow stared at him, its empty eyes fixed on his. An icy cold enveloped his body, making him shiver violently. The figure whispered something that Javier could not understand, but the sensation it produced was clear. Death was stalking him. Desperate, Javier tried to run, but his legs did not respond. Shadows rose around him, enveloping him. A mocking, sinister, and resounding laugh filled the air, as if the very walls were laughing at their suffering. A dark, oppressive energy crushed him, pushed him forward into the unknown. There was no escape. The darkness devoured him. When he finally managed to take a step, the feeling of being watched grew even more. He realized that he was not alone in that hallway, that other presences surrounded him. Formless beings, wandering shadows that seemed to feed on his fear. He could feel their piercing gazes as if their eyes were piercing him, and for a moment, Javier felt his very soul fade under the weight of those empty eyes. As he moved forward, the corridor seemed to get longer and longer. The murmurs of the shadows intensified, and a strange heat began to invade the atmosphere. But it was not the warmth of a friendly presence. It was the heat of something evil, as if hell itself was taking shape around him. A shiver ran down his spine when, in the darkness, he heard a clearer voice, this time human. A man's voice, raspy, broken by time. "Why have you come here?" Javier turned quickly, looking for the source of the voice, but there was nothing, just shadows, twisted and dark. The voice seemed to come from everywhere, echoing in his head. An unbearable weight accumulated in his chest. The pressure was getting more and more intense. The dark figure drew nearer and nearer, and the cold of death caressed his face. The voice resounded again. "This place is not for you. What you find here can never be undone." Javier wanted to scream, but his lips wouldn't move. He tried to turn back, but the corridor closed around him as if the darkness itself had caught him. Shadows began to advance towards him, taking shape, becoming human figures, their eyes empty and their mouths open in a grotesque grimace. "Run!" shouted an inner voice, but Javier could no longer move. The last shadow, the largest and darkest, slipped toward him and stretched out a spectral hand toward his face. The feeling of cold intensified, until all Javier could feel was nothingness. And then the corridor fell into absolute silence. The door, the one he had opened, closed again. The key disappeared, leaving behind a forgotten corridor, awaiting the arrival of the next victim. In the depths of an ancient monastery, surrounded by impenetrable jungle, stood a forgotten reliquary, jealously guarded for centuries by a community of monks. No one knew of its existence except for a select few who, for generations, were in charge of protecting the object that was said to possess supernatural powers. Legend claimed that the reliquary was a container of curse, which had been sealed with spells so dark that anyone who dared to open it would fall into eternal damnation. Over the centuries, many had tried to find it, but none returned, and the monastery fell into oblivion. Today, a renowned archaeologist named Gabriel Vasquez, obsessed with unraveling the secrets of antiquity, arrived at the monastery. He had heard rumors about the reliquary, and the idea that its existence might be linked to humanity's ancient rituals and dark powers drew him in with irresistible force. Despite the warnings of his colleagues who told him about the disappearances of those who had searched for the reliquary, Gabriel decided to undertake the search. His greed to uncover the truth blinded him to danger, and he resolutely ventured deep into the jungle. As he went, the warning signs became clearer. Ruins that had never been documented appeared before his eyes, covered in strange symbols that seemed to move in the gloom, whispering unintelligible words. Gabriel felt a growing sense of anxiety, but his curiosity kept him steadfast. He had come too far to give up now. When he finally arrived at the monastery, he found the building in ruins, covered in weeds, but its structure still stood, almost defiant in the face of the passage of time. Inside, the shadows seemed to take on a life of their own, and a heavy air of desolation permeated every corner. The monks who had cared for him for centuries were gone, but something remained, something sinister. Gabriel could feel it, a tug in his chest, as if a presence was watching him, waiting. He went into the heart of the monastery, an ancient room that seemed untouched by man in centuries. In the center of the room, on an altar covered with dust, rested the reliquary. It was a small object, but it emanated a dense, dark energy, as if it were alive. Gabriel, feeling a mixture of fear and fascination, could not resist the temptation to approach. As he took the locket in his hands, a wave of cold ran through his body. The whispers in the air intensified, and the room seemed to become even darker. However, Gabriel couldn't stop looking at him. At that moment, a spark of doubt crossed his mind, but greed overpowered him. He opened the locket. From that moment on, the world around him changed. Shadows that were once static began to move, taking on distorted and grotesque shapes. A dark figure emerged from the gloom, its red eyes glowing with an evil intensity. It was the spirit of an ancient monk, whose soul had been trapped in the reliquary for centuries, doomed to wander among the plains of the world of the living and the dead. The spirit began to whisper words in a forgotten language, and Gabriel felt his soul tremble, as if the words themselves pierced his mind. The figure approached slowly, floating in the air, and its red eyes locked onto Gabriel's. A sense of indescribable horror came over him. He could feel the cold presence of death beside him, a death that watched him, waiting. The ground began to shake, and Gabriel backed away, terrified. The walls closed around him, as if the monastery were alive, trying to devour him. With each step back, the whispers became more intense, more urgent. Gabriel tried to flee, but the doors of the monastery closed with a deafening roar, and a dark shadow surrounded him completely. His breathing became erratic, and his mind began to wander. He was no longer alone. He felt presences around him, dark figures watching him in silence, waiting for his fall. The monk's spirit was advancing toward him, an invisible force pressing on his chest, making it difficult for him to breathe. The darkness surrounded him, consumed him, and Gabriel could no longer distinguish between reality and the nightmare that was unleashed around him. As the darkness advanced, Gabriel could hear a wail, as if the very walls of the monastery were weeping in agony. The monks who had guarded the reliquary, those who had sacrificed themselves to seal it, were now rising from their graves. Their rotting bodies walked through the shadows, crawling toward him, as if trapped in a prison of eternal death, seeking revenge for the breaking of the seal that had kept the dark forces at bay for centuries. Gabriel tried to scream, but his voice choked in his throat as if something was strangling him. He couldn't move, he couldn't breathe. The terror had completely paralyzed him, and all he could do was look around while the shadows closed in on him. The monk's spirit drew closer, and Gabriel could feel the coldness of his breath on his neck. The last whisper he heard was that of a warning. Death is never forgotten. Death never forgives. Suddenly, a flash of blinding light enveloped him, and the monastery began to crumble around him. The shadows, the figures, everything disintegrated, and the room was plunged into absolute silence. Gabriel was in the center of a dark void, floating in the abyss, without a body, without a soul. The reliquary had served its purpose. He had claimed what belonged to him. And so, the legend of the reliquary of death was fulfilled. No one else would attempt to challenge the limits of the cursed object. The locket, now empty, was sealed again, waiting for its next challenger, its next soul to consume. The small village of San Esteban, nestled in the mountains and surrounded by the thick forest, seemed a quiet place. The stone houses, the red-tiled roofs, and the cobbled streets gave a feeling of serenity, almost from another time. However, beneath that apparent calm, something dark and fearsome had stalked its inhabitants since time immemorial. Every evening, when the sun began to hide behind the trees and the cool night air began to fill the streets, a bell rang in the village church. It was not a normal bell. Its sound did not announce the time, nor did it call for prayer. Every time the bell rang in the air, someone in the village died. No one knew how or why, but everyone knew that the sound was an omen. A death was about to come. The bell was the soul of the people, the dark conscience that kept the balance of fear. The villagers knew this, and though superstition had plagued them for generations, none could escape the unease of hearing its chime. The bell, with its deep, dull sound, was a sentence, and everyone lived under its shadow. Among the inhabitants of San Esteban, no one dared to ask too much. No one wanted to investigate the origins of the bell, for it had always been said that anyone who tried would meet an even more gruesome death. However, that apparent tranquility, the resigned acceptance of fate, was going to be upset one autumn afternoon. That afternoon, the town was full of rumors. The bell had rung louder than usual. No one remembered hearing such a brutal ringing or so often. For some, the sound was so heartbreaking that houses shook. One woman, Araceli, felt the air thicken, as if the atmosphere itself was saturated with something more than fear. His hands twitched as he heard the deep vibration of the metal. His mother, who had always been very superstitious, had told him stories about the bell. He had always said that sound was a reflection of what would happen, and that the louder it was heard, the more imminent death was. That same night, when the shadows were already lengthening in the streets and the trees were rustling in the wind, Araceli walked home, quickening her pace. At first he thought it was his mind playing tricks, but as he approached the edge of the village, he saw a stooped figure, standing, looking toward the church. He was a man of the people, Javier, known for his solitary character. His face was distorted, his eyes fixed on the horizon, unable to look away. "Javier," Araceli called him. "Are you okay?" The man did not react. He didn't seem to hear her. Then a shudder ran through Araceli's body when she heard again the bell ringing. It was a long, deep sound that seemed to resonate in his bones. It was the harbinger of death. Javier's figure began to move slowly as if he were shedding an invisible weight, and with each step he took, his eyes seemed to lose their focus. Darkness enveloped him. Araceli, horrified, approached cautiously. It was then that he saw Javier's hand tremble in the air, as if he were looking for something that did not exist. Javier's scream was the last thing Araceli heard before the bell rang again. Once again the bell rose, and with its echo, death took its form. Javier fell to the ground like a broken wrist as his body began to be claimed by the darkness. Someone had died, and the people, as always, did not know how or why. From that night on, things began to change. People began to see shadows they couldn't explain, murmurs that crossed the streets in silence. No one could be sure they were safe. The inhabitants of San Esteban knew that when the bell rang, death was near, but they never expected that this closeness would become more palpable than ever. Every time the bell rang, someone disappeared. Children no longer played in the streets in the evening. Adults were rushing to close their doors and windows. No one wanted to be next. No one could predict who would be the next to fall. The bell resounded so loudly that it felt as if its echo pierced the bones. There was no peace. There was no hope. People started talking. Some said that the bell had been cursed since its creation. Others believed that someone from deep within the church had invoked a dark force to punish the people. The most superstitious said that the bell would only be silent when all the inhabitants of San Esteban were dead, one by one. And as if it were a sign, a new wave of panic quickly spread through the village. Some tried to flee, but those who did never returned. The roads around St. Stephen's seemed to close behind them, as if an invisible veil separated them from the outside world. People who ventured too far did not return, and those who did were empty-eyed, as if they had seen something that could not be explained. Finally, a group of brave people decided to face the unknown. They went inside the church to investigate the origin of the bell. Araceli, distraught but determined, joined the group, wanting to understand what was happening. They couldn't sit idly by while death took away more and more people. What they found inside the church was more terrifying than anyone could have imagined. The bell, suspended in the air, seemed to radiate a dark energy. as if it were alive. No one dared to approach. The bell, its metal blackened by the passage of time, vibrated gently. The walls of the church creaked as if something was about to break. The clocks of the church, without any explanation, marked the exact same time, the hour of death. At that moment, Araceli felt a presence behind her. He turned quickly, but all he could see was an imposing shadow, a masked figure emerging from the darkness. The bell, now fully resonant, emitted a thunderous sound that made the ground beneath his feet tremble. One by one, the brave ones fell, as if the air itself had become poisonous. Araceli was the last to be left standing. As the echo of the bell echoed in his chest, he realized that death was not something that could be avoided, that the bell was not a mere instrument of warning, but the very face of death. The figure that had stalked her, the shadow that had watched her for so long, slowly approached. "It's too late for everyone, child," whispered the shadow. Before Araceli could react, the bell rang for the last time. A shudder ran through her body, and an unsettling peace enveloped her. The last bell rang in the air, and with it, the fate of San Esteban was sealed. Death had claimed everyone. The campaign stopped, and everything was silent. The village had been consumed, and there was no trace of its inhabitants. The church was in ruins, the bell no longer sounded. But in the fog that surrounded the town, its echo seemed to continue to resound. The town of San Esteban disappeared, but its history was never forgotten. The echo of the bell was still alive, waiting for the next victim, the next soul that crossed its path. Thus ended the last bell. A man named Marcos was in a small antique market on the outskirts of town, looking for something unique to decorate his house. He had visited several stores, but none of them seemed to offer what he was looking for. The sun was beginning to set, tinting the sky a faint orange, as soft light illuminated the old, dusty objects that lined the shelves. There was something special about that market, something that attracted the curious and lovers of the old. However, she did not know that that afternoon would change her life forever. In the far corner of the antique store, something caught his eye. It was a mirror covered with a black velvet cloth. Its frame, carved from dark wood, seemed centuries old. But what really captivated Mark was the strange energy emanating from it. Without thinking much, he approached and, with a fearful gesture, lifted the cloth that covered him. The first thing he noticed was the reflection. The mirror did not show the antique shop as one would expect. Instead, it reflected a dark corridor covered in shadows. It was as if, somehow, the mirror was a portal to another place, a place that had nothing to do with the reality I knew. The salesman, a strange-looking and aged man, observed Marcos's reaction. "That mirror, it has a history. He's not like the others," she said in a raspy voice. "It is said that it shows what we do not want to see, what we fear." Mark, intrigued by the mysterious warning, asked more, but the man simply waved his hand. "What you see cannot be erased. If you decide to take it, don't go back to me for answers." Without thinking about it any longer, Marcos paid the price and took the mirror, ignorant of what awaited him. From the moment she placed him in her house, a sense of unease began to wash over her. It was as if something was constantly watching him. I couldn't stop looking at the mirror, but as I did, I began to feel a presence. At first, it was just a whisper in his mind, a passing sensation that he quickly dismissed as suggested by the salesman's story. But as night fell, things began to change. As the daylight faded and darkness invaded his home, he began to notice something strange in the reflection of the mirror. A movement, something that slipped through the shadows of that corridor that appeared in the glass. It wasn't something clear or defined, but something was definitely moving, something that shouldn't be there. Mark, with a mixture of curiosity and terror, approached the mirror, observing more closely. It was then that he saw her for the first time. A female figure, her face obscured by long dark hair, appeared in the reflection. His body was on its back, but his movements were unsettling, as if he was slowly walking towards him, unhurriedly. Fear took hold of him, but the worst was yet to come. Each night, as I looked in the mirror, the figure began to get closer and closer, until the time came when I could clearly see his face. A pale face without eyes, with an empty expression, a macabre grimace that seemed to follow him, to observe him without rest. When Mark turned to look around his house, he found nothing out of the ordinary. But when she turned her gaze to the mirror, the woman was closer than she had ever imagined. As the days went by, the presence of the figure began to become more tangible, more oppressive. During the night hours, Marcos could not sleep. He always felt that something was watching him, something that was stalking him in the dark. In his house, a feeling of lingering cold began to spread to every corner. The air seemed to become dense, as if an invisible pressure enveloped him, making it difficult for him to breathe, as if each inhalation was a painful exertion. He tried to ignore the images he saw in the mirror, but he couldn't. He couldn't stop looking, as if an invisible force was forcing him to do so. Each time he looked away, the woman's figure seemed closer, more alive, more real. I felt her empty gaze fixed on him, feeling the weight of his presence in every corner of the room. The figure was not only watching him from the mirror, but began to manifest outside of it. Marcos saw strange shadows in the reflection, figures fading and appearing, as if the house itself were being invaded by that dark corridor. Sometimes I heard footsteps, faint whispers that could not be explained. His mind was filled with dark thoughts, as if something was inside him, controlling his thoughts and his body. One night, unable to bear it any longer, he tried to get rid of the mirror. He covered it with a blanket, kept it in the basement, but the woman's feeling never went away. In his dreams, she was chasing him, her empty eyes fixed on him, getting closer and closer until darkness enveloped him completely. I woke up in a cold sweat, feeling that something had changed. Something had crossed into the real world from the reflection. That's when the figure began to speak, a soft, almost whispering voice that didn't come from any physical place, but that he could hear clearly in his mind. "I've been watching you, Marcos. I followed you from the moment you first looked at me. You're mine now, and you always will be." The words completely froze him. Each night, the visits became more frequent, and the woman's presence began to take on a more solid shape. Terror consumed him, but there was no escape. In the mirrors of each room, the woman appeared, always closer, always more threatening. He began to lose track of time. He spent his nights staring at the reflection, caught by its empty gaze, as if something inside him was holding him captive. The shadows grew longer in every corner of the house, and fear enveloped him more with each passing hour. One afternoon, while he was in front of the mirror, Marcos saw something he never imagined. The woman's figure began to come out of the reflection. First, his fingers touching the glass, then a full hand, until the figure completely slid into the real world. His skin was cold, his body thin and twisted, as if he were a shadow in human form. His face was completely empty, with no eyes, but his lips curled into a malevolent smile. Marcos tried to scream, but his voice choked in his throat. He couldn't move, he couldn't escape. The woman approached him, her cold and long fingers touching his face, caressing his skin as if it were a macabre caress. He could feel the chill of her presence enveloping him, an indescribable sense of terror paralyzing him, as if he were trapped in a nightmare that would never end. The figure spoke again, his voice now louder, deeper. "Now you are mine forever. You'll never escape me. You are condemned to live in my reflection." Marcos tried to move away, but his body was no longer responding. Darkness surrounded him, and the figure dragged him into the mirror. Their screams were silenced, and the house fell into a deadly silence. From that moment on, no one saw Marcos again. The house was empty, his mirror there in the same place where he had left it. The reflection, as always, showed that dark corridor, with a female figure walking slowly, getting closer and closer, a presence that stalked those who dared to look. The eyeless woman continued her journey like a shadow that never goes out, always waiting for the next victim who dared to buy the mirror. The antiques market still exists, but no one remembers the man who disappeared in the reflection, nor the warning he left behind. The mirror is still waiting, hidden in a corner, with the figure of the lady watching those who approach, waiting for the right moment to come out again. Maria had always been a very talented artist. His brushes, guided by his trembling hands, managed to capture the deepest part of the human soul on each canvas. However, despite his success, he was never able to find a true connection to the masterpiece he felt he was meant to create. He wanted something bigger, something that would define his career and his life. So he had decided to retreat to a cottage in the country, away from the hustle and bustle of the city, in search of that spark of inspiration he was so missing. The cabin was located in a remote location, surrounded by a dense forest that seemed to have been forgotten by time. When Maria arrived, the first thing she noticed was the heavy, dense air, as if nature itself were watching her. The wooden walls creaked under the weight of the years, and the wind that whispered through the cracks of the cabin seemed to carry echoes of distant voices. Maria, however, did not pay much attention to it. She was determined to find what she was looking for, the inspiration for her masterpiece. It was several days before Maria began to feel the weight of loneliness. During the day, he would dedicate himself to painting, capturing the essence of nature on canvases. But as night fell, the atmosphere in the cabin became more and more oppressive. The creaking of the wood and the whispers of the wind were beginning to take on an unsettling hue, as if someone were watching her. One afternoon, after several failed attempts to find inspiration, Maria decided that her next portrait would be different. Instead of the tranquil landscape she had been painting, she decided to create a portrait of herself. He wanted to capture the deepest look of his soul, the one he had never shown to the world. He got ready, placed the canvas on the easel, and began to paint, letting himself be carried away by his darkest emotions. As he moved forward, he began to feel a strange sensation, as if something was happening in the air, but he decided to ignore it and continue. The paint on her face was beginning to take shape, and although at first it was only a reflection of herself, something was beginning to change. His eyes on the canvas seemed more alive, more intense. Suddenly, the lines of the portrait seemed to move, as if the image was breathing. Maria put the brush down in her hand and watched, horrified. It couldn't be possible. The portrait was moving, his eyes sliding back and forth as if searching for something in the dark. A cold sweat ran down his back. What was happening? He tried to give it a few more touches, but as he did so, the figure seemed to come to life. Suddenly, the portrait began to cry. He cried blood. A torrent of red poured from his eyes, bathing the canvas as the paint distorted as if a tormented soul was trapped inside. Maria backed away in horror, paralyzed by fear. The screams of the figure in the portrait seemed to resonate in her mind, a sound she could not understand but which filled her with terror. The portrait seemed to be watching her with fury, with hatred. It wasn't his own reflection that was painted on the canvas, but something much darker, something that had never existed in his real life. Trembling, Maria tried to cover the portrait with a cloth, but she couldn't get out of his sight. The painting cried incessantly, as if it were alive. As the hours passed, the crying became louder, more unbearable. Every tear of blood fell to the floor, causing the room to be filled with a metallic smell, and the atmosphere became more and more oppressive. Something was wrong. Something very wrong. The portrait didn't just cry. He was beginning to move more, squirming on the canvas as if he were looking for a way out. Maria, terrified, began to hear whispers coming from the portrait. Every word was incomprehensible, but every single one of them resonated in his mind with terrifying force. He covered his ears with his hands, but whispers seeped into his mind, as if an evil presence was taking control of his thoughts. In desperation, Maria tried to leave the cabin, but the doors slammed shut as if the cabin itself wanted to trap her. The air was becoming thick, and the walls seemed to shrink around him. Every corner was filled with shadows that moved, as if they were lurking, waiting. The cabin was no longer a refuge, it had become a trap. The painter began to feel how the energy of painting enveloped her. The figure in the portrait called to her, attracted her. Every time he looked at the canvas, he felt part of his soul detach and join the portrait. Fear consumed her, but she couldn't get away. He knew he had to destroy the painting, but he didn't know how. Each attempt to touch the portrait only made the figure more alive, as if every brushstroke he added strengthened it. One night, while trying to sleep, he was awakened by a strange noise. The cry of the painting called to her, but this time there was something else. The whispers were clearer, more direct. The voice that emanated from the painting was hers, as if it were she herself who cried, who asked for help. Maria began to feel something inside her change. Desperation took hold of her. The terror I felt was no longer just because of what I saw, but because of what I was beginning to understand. The figure in the portrait was not only a representation of her, but was taking her place, absorbing her essence, her life. If I didn't destroy the portrait, I would end up being part of it, trapped on the canvas forever. In desperation, Maria took a knife and began cutting the canvas, attempting to destroy the figure before it was too late. But each cut only made the figure more powerful. The shadows in the room were twisting, and the cabin began to vibrate as if something dark was waking up. With each cut, the portrait cried louder, and the blood that fell from the canvas began to drip onto the floor, forming dark puddles that seemed to swallow everything they touched. Terror took hold of her completely. I could no longer distinguish between the real thing and what I was seeing in the painting. His mind was cracking. and the whispers were turning into unbearable screams. The figure in the portrait was no longer just looking at her. Now he pointed at her as if he were condemning her. Mary knew that she had no time, that she had to destroy it immediately. With one last effort, he took the portrait and threw it into the fire in the fireplace. The canvas began to burn, but the scream that the figure uttered when the fire touched it was the most frightful he had ever heard. The flames seemed to devour the paint, but something else was happening. The shadows that had once moved around the hut were now concentrated in the fire, as if they wanted to prevent the portrait from disappearing. When the portrait was finally consumed in the flames, the hut fell silent. The air cleared and the oppressive atmosphere began to dissipate. Maria fell to the ground, exhausted but relieved. The feeling of being watched, of being hunted, had disappeared. However, when he looked at his hands, he noticed something strange. His skin was beginning to take on a gray hue as if it was crumbling. His body felt light, almost ethereal, and his face reflected an expression of horror that he had never seen before. At that moment, he understood what had happened. She hadn't destroyed the portrait. The portrait had destroyed her. In the stillness of a remote corner of the forest, where the shadows of the trees stretched like the arms of a sleeping giant, a man named Marcos arrives at an isolated cabin to escape the busy city life. I had heard about the beauty of nature in that place, and the tranquility it offered. No worries, no pressures, no constant invasion of the modern world. Just him and the landscape. That was all he needed to rest from his daily routine. The cottage, though rustic and somewhat dated, had the charm of the old days, with a stone fireplace, large windows overlooking the thick forest, and a sense of seclusion that pleased him. It was everything you could want for a solo holiday, without the interference of people or the bustle of everyday life. That night, after a day exploring the forest, he lit a fire in the fireplace and sat down on the sofa, deep in thought. The creaking of burning wood was the only sound that interrupted the deep silence of the night. Shadows danced on the walls of the cabin, as the darkness outside stretched beyond the reach of the light. He went to bed early that night, exhausted from the walk, but something in the air kept him restless. There was something strange about the stillness, something I couldn't identify. He tried to calm his mind, but the feeling persisted. He closed his eyes and fell into a restless sleep. Dawn came with a faint glow, barely filtered through the leaves that covered the windows. Mark woke up abruptly, feeling a strange pressure in the air. It was not the sound of the wind, nor the nature that I used to hear in the morning. Something felt different, as if the atmosphere were charged with an unsettling energy. When he got out of bed, he noticed something strange. On the floor of the room, right in front of the door, there was a large footprint, bright red, as if someone had left a mark on the ground, but it looked like anything else. The footprint wasn't just fresh blood. It was as if the mark was alive, latent, as if it had been left behind by something far more sinister than a simple accident. Marcos approached cautiously, the air in the room weighing on him like a blanket. The footprint stretched across the floor, leading to the door of the cabin. Trembling, he bent down to examine her more closely. It wasn't a mistake, nor something that could have been left by accident. It was a clear mark, an ominous sign that seemed to mock him. The footprint did not end there. When he opened the door, he noticed that he continued down the hallway, down the stairs to the main entrance of the cabin. Panic began to take hold of him, but curiosity grew stronger. He decided to follow the track, although he felt the weight of fear crushing his chest. As the footprint moved along the outside of the cabin, the feeling that something was watching him intensified. The nature around was in complete silence. Not the wind, not the birds, not the insects. Only the sound of his own footsteps stepping on the damp earth. The footprint led him into the forest, a shadowy path that led into the thick trees. Every step he took into the heart of the forest seemed to make him farther away from the safety of the cabin. The daylight was no longer enough to dispel the shadows which seemed to lengthen towards him, slowly surrounding him. Gradually, the footprint began to show an increasingly grotesque shape. Instead of being just a mark of blood, it now seemed to be accompanied by strange distortions, as if the terrain itself was being altered by something invisible. The earth was marked by strange signs, ancient symbols that I could not comprehend. The panic began to turn into something deeper. Mark tried to turn back, but the footprint drew him, as if he had a will of his own, as if something in the forest was calling him, guiding him. In his attempt to return to the cabin, he noticed that the forest looked different now. The treetops, once familiar, now looked strange, as if they were watching him, as if they knew him. A shudder ran down his spine. When he arrived at a clearing in the forest, he saw something that completely paralyzed him. In the center of the clearing, there was a figure erect, standing, waiting. The figure was indistinct, without clear features, but its presence was terrifying. It wasn't human, but it seemed to have a form, a structure. An echo of his humanity, but distorted. The bloody footprint had led him there. And as he approached, the figure moved. The scene in front of him crumbled into chaos. The earth began to tremble and the air became dense, as if an invisible force imprisoned it. The figure in the clearing dissolved, and the shadows of the trees began to twist, growing towards him. The ground split, and what seemed like an unbreakable peace turned into a nightmare of horror and despair. Marcos tried to run, but each step he took plunged him deeper into darkness. The bloody footprint, like a threat from the unknown, haunted him. Every time he turned, he saw the distortions in the air, the symbols gliding over the ground. The trees seemed to move, as if they were part of a sentient entity, watching him, stalking. The horror reached its peak when it reached the edge of a precipice. The forest seemed to have engulfed him, and all that remained was emptiness. The bloody footprint was there on the edge of the abyss, and Mark, now completely plunged into terror, saw a figure emerge from the shadows, his own reflection distorted, grotesque, standing in front of him. And then, as if all the accumulated terror had only one purpose, the footprint began to drag him away. A violent tug pushed him into the abyss, into the void, as the shadows devoured him completely. The man disappeared into the darkness of the forest, and the man, the bloody one, as if it had never existed, vanished into the earth. The echo of his cry echoed in the distance, but no one heard him. The forest, again in silence, kept the last vestige of its passage, until another visitor arrived, unwary to follow the trail of the bloody track. It had been a long journey on lonely roads, in a place forgotten by time and the passage of men. The traveler, tired and exhausted, had not seen any sign of life for miles. The road was like an endless river of asphalt, flanked by trees that stretched out to the horizon, as if they wanted to devour it. The sunlight was beginning to fade, dyeing the sky a warm, ominous red. He thought about stopping at any hostel, but in his desperation he barely saw a small sign indicating the existence of a hotel. "Forgotten Hotel," read the faded paint on the sign. It seemed perfect for an overnight stay, a refuge, a break from the endless road. When he arrived, the place seemed much older than he had expected. The walls of the hotel, covered in moss and mold, gave the impression that the place had been forgotten by the whole world. The building was large, two-story, with broken windows and doors that creaked as they moved. However, something about the place attracted him, and fatigue pushed him to enter. The door opened with a frightful creak, but on the other side there was nothing but darkness. He hesitated for a moment, but then the need for rest overcame logic. He pushed open the door, which slowly gave way, revealing the hall. The front desk was dark, with only a dim light flickering over the counter. A strange-looking man with an aged face and an expressionless gaze was sitting behind the counter. He didn't say anything, just looked up and gave him a room key. The traveler accepted it with an uncomfortable feeling in his stomach. The atmosphere was strange, as if time did not exist within the walls of the hotel. He climbed the stairs, feeling the weight of the stairs creak beneath his feet. When he reached the hallway, he realized that the walls were covered with old photographs, but not the typical family photographs. No, they showed strange and distorted faces, people with empty eyes and disconcerting expressions. Somehow, those images seemed familiar, as if they were staring at him. However, he kept going, ignoring a sensation that he couldn't shake. The room was small, with an aged-looking wooden bed and a window that looked out onto a desolate landscape, as if the world were just an endless expanse of gray land. The lamp flickered, and when he turned off the light, the room was plunged into deep darkness. But something wasn't right. There was a smell of humidity and something else in the air. Something he couldn't identify, something that made him uncomfortable. He went to bed, but he couldn't sleep. Shadows seemed to move around the room, slipping through cracks in the walls and ceiling. He got up, and as he approached the window, he looked more closely at the outside. There was no movement in the landscape, but something in the distance caught his attention. A figure standing in the middle of the field, motionless, looking towards the hotel. The figure looked human, but its posture was strange, as if it was unnatural. The traveler looked away, feeling a twinge in his chest, but when he looked again, the figure had disappeared. Restlessness began to take hold of him, and he decided to leave the room. He returned to the corridor where the old portrait seemed to look at him with more intensity. Upon arriving at the lobby, he noticed that the man at the front desk was no longer there. Instead, a door was ajar, and on the other side, a light flickered faintly. Intrigued, he walked over and pushed her cautiously. What he saw took his breath away. In the room was a wooden table covered with dust, and on it an old photo album. He approached and opened it. The photos were from previous hotel guests, but something was wrong. The people in the photos did not have full faces. Their eyes were hollow, empty, and their smiles distorted. On the last page, one photo in particular made his blood run cold. It was him. He was in the picture, even though he had never been there before. The image showed his face with empty eyes and a macabre smile that froze his soul. Suddenly, the ground beneath his feet began to creak, and a deafening sound, like a murmur of whispering voices, filled the air. The walls began to shake, and the traveler felt as if the shadows in the corridor surrounded him. In horror, he noticed that the figures in the photos seemed to come to life, their empty eyes fixed on him as their lips formed mute words. Suddenly, one of the figures detached from the photo and dissolved into a dark fog that began to envelop him. Fear invaded him completely. He ran to the door, but before he could reach it, the figure in the photograph appeared before him, now a grim specter, with a sinister smile that seemed to mock his despair. The figure stretched out its hand towards him, and the traveler, unable to move, felt as if the air were escaping from his lungs. Every corner of the hotel was filled with voices whispering dark secrets about everyone who had been there before him. The hotel's former guests, those who had disappeared without a trace, were now part of an eternal curse. The traveler, in his attempt to escape, ran to the exit, but in the hall he saw the walls crumble, photographs falling from the walls, and figures in the photos sliding toward him closer and closer. He tried to open the door, but it was sealed, trapped inside the hotel. In a last-ditch attempt to find a way out, he stepped into the darkness of the hallway, but the sound of whispering voices surrounded him completely. All he could hear was a distant echo, one last warning: no one leaves this hotel. The hotel, that crumbling construction that seemed to be on the edge of nowhere, swallowed the traveler, and his soul was trapped next to the former guests, condemned to repeat their agony over and over again. The shadows of the hotel continued to lurk, awaiting the arrival of another lone traveler who would fall into its trap, unable to escape the horrors that lurked within its walls. It was a dark and cold night when, after hours of driving on desolate roads, David finally saw the lights of the forgotten hotel. He was alone on the journey, and the road seemed endless. The thick fog that covered the landscape gave him a sense of deep isolation, almost as if the world had disappeared. The hotel sign, covered in dust and rust, flickered faintly with the yellowish light coming from a lamp that seemed to be on the verge of going out. However, at that moment, David did not hesitate to stop his car. The cold penetrated his bones the instant he got out of the vehicle. There were no signs of life in the vicinity, only the sound of the wind blowing dry leaves. He walked slowly toward the hotel, feeling a strange writhing in his stomach, but forced himself to ignore it. He needed a place to rest, and this was the only establishment visible for miles around. As I entered, the atmosphere was charged with a silence so deep that it seemed to devour any sound. The reception was empty, but the door closed behind him with a thud, as if something was waiting that couldn't come out. The only light came from an old lamp that dimly illuminated a dusty staircase. Footsteps echoed on the creaky wooden floor as he made his way to the counter. A peculiar-looking man appeared from the shadows. His face was pale, with sunken eyes and a strange smile that could not hide his discomfort. Despite his unsettling presence, the man was kind to offer him a room. "A single night, right?" he asked, his voice as soft as the whisper of the wind outside. David nodded, feeling the discomfort of not being able to see the receptionist's face well. He was handed the key to room 23, which appeared to be the only one available, and the man pointed to a door in the dark hallway. Without thinking too much, David headed there. As he walked, the feeling of discomfort grew, as if the corridors of the hotel were alive, watching him, waiting for something. The door to room 23 creaked as it opened. Inside, everything seemed to be covered in a layer of dust and dirt, but the bed, somewhat rickety, was made, which gave him a strange sense of tranquility. On the bedside table, an oil lamp emitted a soft light, as if someone had left everything in its place, ready to receive it. David put his backpack on the floor and sat up on the bed. He decided not to think about his thoughts anymore and lay down, staring at the ceiling as he listened to the incessant creaking of the wood under his weight. The wind was howling outside, but nothing seemed out of place, at least for now. Gradually, his eyes closed, but before he fell into a deep sleep, he heard something. A whisper. It seemed far away, perhaps coming from the corridor, but he did not give it importance. As the night wore on, the sound became clearer, more insistent. It was a low murmur, as if someone were speaking in a low voice, barely audible but constant. David tried to ignore it and covered his head with his pillow. However, what troubled him most was not the whisper, but the feeling that someone else was in the room with him. The next morning, he woke up sweating. He had had a vivid nightmare filled with shadows and echoes of voices surrounding him. The sunlight barely came through the windows, but he decided it would be best to get out of there as soon as possible. However, when trying to leave, something strange happened. The door to the room wouldn't open. He tried to turn the handle hard, but it wouldn't move. A cold sweat began to run down his forehead as he felt panic wash over him. Suddenly, a soft, distant laugh could be heard behind him. He turned quickly, but no one was there. Fear caught up with him quickly, and his breathing quickened. He started banging on the door in desperation. But when he looked down, something caught his attention. On the ground there were footprint marks, as if someone had walked there. They were large and heavy, and seemed to vanish into thin air as if they had never existed. The atmosphere in the room felt denser, and a shudder ran through his body as he saw footprints begin to form around him. The door slammed open, leaving him with his heart racing and his body tense with fear. A dark corridor awaited him. A corridor where the shadows seemed to move strangely, as if they were watching his footsteps. He advanced cautiously, fearing what he might find, but when he reached the end of the hall, he saw a figure. A man standing in front of the window, staring out. The man was of a slim build with a gloomy face, and his figure seemed to emanate a sense of deep sadness. David approached, but the man did not move. When he was close enough, the man spoke without turning. "Did you stay overnight?" he asked, his voice soft, like a whisper lost in the wind. David nodded, not knowing what to answer. The man turned it around slowly, and that's when David saw it right. His face was marked by scars and wrinkles, but the worst thing was his empty gaze, as if his soul had been ripped from his body. The feeling of terror enveloped David, and he felt a shudder in his spine. "This hotel is full of shadows," the man continued. "Shadows of those who died here. No one leaves, no one escapes." David backed away, feeling the terror paralyze him. He wanted to flee, but his legs did not respond. The man began to walk toward him, and with each step, his body faded further until he became a shadow, an ethereal presence surrounding David. "You're going to stay here with us, just like the others." The room began to darken around him. The light from the oil lamp suddenly went out, and the corridor was filled with twisted shadows, figures floating aimlessly, slowly moving towards him. The feeling of despair enveloped him. He was no longer alone. The place became a prison, and the shadows of the people who had died there surrounded it. "This place never closes," whispered the shadow, "and you won't go out either." David tried to scream, but his voice wouldn't come out. His whole body was paralyzed. The shadows enveloped him, and somehow he knew that his soul would be the next to be trapped forever. The doors of the hotel crashed shut, and the darkness consumed him completely. There were no more screams, only the eternal whisper of the lost souls that still wandered through the forgotten hotel. St. Brace's University had witnessed hundreds of stories, from the early days of its founding to the modern era. Its Gothic architecture, with its towering towers and dark corridors, inspired both respect and fear. No one really knew every corner of campus. The oldest spoke of forgotten corridors, locked doors, and underground passages that led to places that should never be discovered. Thomas, a young history student, had heard many of these stories in the hallways, whispered quietly by his older classmates. Like many others, he considered them mere legends, nothing more than ghost tales that served to scare new ones. But there was something different about him, an insatiable curiosity to unveil the secrets of the past. So when he came across an old key in a dusty corner of the library one day, he couldn't help but be drawn to it. The key looked old, as if it belonged to an object forgotten centuries ago. No one seemed to recognize her, and this only added to the mystery surrounding her. That afternoon, as he walked around campus, his mind kept spinning over that key. He felt a strange connection to her, as if something was calling him. It was then that, while walking near the east side of the university, he noticed something peculiar, a small corridor that he had never seen before. Although he knew every corner of the place well, it seemed to have materialized out of nowhere. The walls covered in ivy and mold, and the dim light that filtered through the broken windows made it seem like a place lost in time. Deep within that hallway, the atmosphere felt dense, as if the air itself was charged with dark energy. Tomas's heart was pounding as he walked down the hallway, key in hand, as if he'd been waiting all his time to get to that place. His footsteps echoed on the stone floor, and the echo seemed to follow him as if the corridor were alive and watching. At the end of the corridor, a solid wooden door, covered with dust and cobwebs, stood before him. Something inside him knew that was where he should use the key. As he inserted the key into the lock, a strange whisper rose into the air, almost inaudible at first, but growing with each turn of the key. It was as if someone was whispering his name, calling to him from beyond the door. Sweat began to trickle down his forehead as the door slowly opened, revealing a dark room, a room that had been closed for generations. As he crossed the threshold, Thomas was overcome by a sensation of intense cold, which ran down his spine and froze his bones. The walls were covered with strange symbols which seemed to move as he watched them. The air in the room was dense, as if the atmosphere itself was polluted by something ancient, something that had been waiting a long time to be discovered. In the distance, in the center of the room, an old wooden table was surrounded by broken chairs, and on the table a closed book seemed to be waiting for him. Thomas cautiously approached the book, feeling the weight of the story and the mystery that surrounded it. With trembling hands, he opened the book, only to find pages covered in red ink, as if they had been written in blood. The words in the book did not seem to form coherent sentences, but were fragments that spoke of rituals, of dark pacts, and of a presence that lived in the halls of the university, waiting for the right moment to reclaim those who dared to discover its existence. As he read, a strange feeling of dizziness came over him. Whispers that had previously been barely perceptible were now clearly audible. Voices coming from everywhere, but I couldn't identify where they came from. The voices called him by name, whispering promises and warnings. He felt as if something was watching him from the shadows, as if something was waiting for him to make a mistake, something that could condemn him. Suddenly, the lights in the room flickered and went out. The corridor behind him seemed to have lengthened, and the door through which he had entered was no longer visible. He saw only darkness, a black chasm expanding before him. At that instant, a loud noise made him spin. Something was moving quickly towards him, a whisper that transformed into a guttural, inhuman scream full of rage. Fear invaded him completely, but he could not move. He was paralyzed, trapped in a labyrinth of darkness and terror. Cold fingers landed on his shoulder, and his body reacted immediately, giving him a shudder that made him take a step back. He turned, but no one was there. Just the echo of his own heartbeat echoing in his ears. However, the air was charged with an invisible presence surrounding him. The voices intensified, and they began to speak in a language that he did not understand, but that resonated deep within his being. His eyes widened as the figure of a woman appeared in front of him, her face haggard, her eyes empty of emotion, but filled with infinite sadness. Thomas tried to scream, but his throat didn't respond, as if something was choking him from the inside. The woman began to walk towards him, and with every step she took, the ground shook slightly. When he was in front of him, his lips moved slowly, but the words did not reach his ear. It was not a human language, but something more primitive, something that belonged to a lost age. Suddenly, Thomas felt a pressure on his chest, as if the air itself was crushing him. The woman stretched out her hand towards him, and at that instant the lights came back on, but the room was completely transformed. I was no longer in the dark and dusty place, but in an ethereal space outside of time, where everything looked distorted, as if the world itself was broken. It was as if he had been transported to a place that did not belong to reality. The voices surrounded him, and now he could see them. Shadows of human figures, all with the same empty and sad expressions, all whispering but not saying anything he could understand. The shadows closed in on him, and as they surrounded him, an excruciating pressure took over his mind. He wanted to scream, but the words choked in his throat. Finally, the woman spoke, and this time her words were clear, though filled with overwhelming darkness. "The corridor is alive. It always has been. All those who have crossed its doors have been claimed. And now, it's your turn." Panic took hold of him, but he couldn't move. The darkness surrounded him, and the voices called to him, full of despair, of pain. The hallway had been created to trap curious souls, to keep them trapped in an endless cycle, and now Thomas had become part of that cycle. The woman, now a shadowy figure, looked at him with infinite sadness, as if she were sorry. The hallway was never a physical place. It was a threshold, a line between the world of the living and the world of the dead, and once crossed, there was no turning back. Tomas never returned. The whispering hall closed behind him, and the voices died away, leaving only the echo of his lost existence. The mystery of St. Bryce's University continued, and the legends about the forgotten corridor grew more somber. No one else dared to look for that hallway, but those passing by swore they heard whispers, as if the hallway was waiting for the next victim. Ever since he moved into the old apartment building, Javier had felt a strange presence. It wasn't something tangible, but a nagging sense of being watched. The building, with its narrow corridors and mold on the walls, seemed to have a life of its own. However, what worried him most was not the age of the place, or even the strange noises during the night. What really disturbed him was the absolute silence during the day, as if the building was waiting for something or someone. When Javier signed the contract, he was excited. He had been looking for a place where he could live alone, a refuge where he could focus on his work and be away from the hustle and bustle of the city. The price was incredibly low, almost too good to be true, but the realtor, an older man with a serious look, assured him that there would be no problem. However, he did not tell her everything. The first night was quiet until something strange happened. Javier woke up in the middle of the night, startled by a feeling of discomfort. "I felt like something wasn't right, but I couldn't identify what it was. The air in his apartment was heavy, dense, as if someone was standing in the same room watching him. At first he thought it was darkness playing tricks with his mind, but when he looked down the hall, he could swear that he saw a slowly moving shadow. It wasn't the first time she'd moved. I had been to several places before, and I had never experienced anything like it. Even though I was used to moving and living in new places, something about this apartment seemed different. The air was charged with an energy that kept him alert, a heavy energy, as if something was trapped in that place and couldn't escape. At first, Javier tried to ignore him. He thought it was his mind, perhaps too tired from the stress of moving and adjusting to his new routine. But as the days passed, the feelings of discomfort only got worse. Every time he found himself in the hallway, he felt something following him. But when he looked back, there was nothing. It took several weeks before he decided to investigate the apartment's past. The realtor hadn't told her much about the previous tenants, only that the unit had been empty for several months. Javier felt that he needed to know more, as if that knowledge could help him understand why he felt that he was not alone. It was then that he met the neighbor of the apartment next door, a middle-aged woman named Mariana. She was sitting in the doorway, apparently waiting for someone to come by. Javier, with his natural curiosity, approached and struck up a conversation. "Do you know anything about apartment 304? He asked, pointing to her door. Mariana stared at him for a few seconds before answering. Something in his eyes didn't seem to want to talk about it, but finally, he sighed. "That place, he's not like the others," he said quietly. "The last tenant disappeared. Nobody knows what happened to him, but the building was never the same after that." Javier frowned, confused. "Did it disappear? How? What do you mean he was never the same?" Mariana looked at him again, this time more cautiously. "That person never came back. It wasn't a simple abandonment, you understand? It was as if it had vanished. And after that, strange things started to happen. People have stopped living there. They have had experiences. Nobody wants to talk about it, but maybe you should leave before something happens to you." Javier felt a chill run down his spine. He didn't know if what Mariana was saying to him was a joke, a superstition, or something more serious. However, he couldn't ignore the lingering feeling he had since moving in. It was as if the apartment was imbued with a dark energy that constantly surrounded him. That night, as he was getting ready for sleep, he heard a soft whisper coming from the hallway. It was almost inaudible, but enough to startle him. I didn't understand where it came from, but I couldn't stop thinking about what Mariana had said. The feeling of being watched intensified, as if something was waiting outside his door, waiting to enter. Determined to find out the truth, Javier began to investigate more about the apartment. In the building manager's office, he gained access to the old records. There he found an entrance that mentioned the last tenant of 304, a man named Ivan Paredes. According to records, Ivan had been an ordinary man with no criminal record, someone who had lived in the building for nearly 2 years before disappearing without a trace. There were no signs of a struggle in his apartment. There was nothing to indicate that something had gone wrong, except for the nagging feeling that something had vanished. No one in the building seemed to know more, but Javier could sense that there was something dark hiding, something he couldn't fully comprehend. As the days passed, the presence in the apartment became more intense. Every night, Javier woke up with the feeling that someone was in his room, standing next to his bed, watching him in silence. At times, he felt cold breathing on his face, and when he turned around, he found no one. The shadows seemed to move along the walls, twisting and changing shape as if they were taking on a life of their own. The straw that broke the camel's back was when, one night, Javier woke up to find his mirror fogged up, but with something written on it. The letters seemed to form slowly, as if something invisible was writing the words in the cold mist of the glass. "I'm looking at you," he said. Fear took hold of him, and he knew he could no longer ignore it. It was as if Ivan, the former tenant, had never left the place. Something in his spirit had been trapped, doomed to wander around the apartment looking for a way to communicate. Javier tried to seek help, but all efforts were in vain. No one in the building seemed willing to talk openly about what was going on there. Mariana refused to say more, and the other neighbors simply walked away as if afraid to face the truth. Javier tried to do everything he could to flee from the presence, but he was trapped. One day, when he entered his apartment, the door slammed shut behind him and the light went out. It was completely dark, unable to move or find a way out. He felt a pressure in his chest, as if someone was choking him, and then he heard a voice, soft but clear, whispering in his ear, "I'm waiting for you." The door slammed open, and Javier ran out of the apartment, trembling with terror. He knew that something in the apartment would not let him go. It had been an illusion to think that he could escape the curse that had taken over the place. Fear would haunt him forever. The spirit of the last tenant, Ivan, would never leave him. Somehow, Javier had now become part of the cycle, and the apartment would follow him, trap him in its web. It didn't matter how far it went. The darkness would always find its way to him, and there would be no escape. The last tenant was not just a story of a lost spirit, but of a far more powerful force, something that transcended death and life itself, something that could never be forgotten. A group of hikers decided to venture into one of the most mysterious caverns in the country, a place known for its depth and dark secrets. The cave, located in a remote mountainous region, was famous among caving enthusiasts, but few dared to explore it completely due to the legends that revolved around it. It was said that those who entered beyond a certain point never returned, and although many took it as simple old wives' tales, the sense of unease was palpable. It was a gray day when the group, made up of 5 people, entered the cave. The expedition had begun with enthusiasm and laughter, sharing anecdotes and enjoying the thrill of the unknown. As they made their way through the narrow corridors, the air became denser and the temperature dropped, but still, no one seemed worried. Their lanterns cut through the darkness, creating long, twisted shadows on the rock walls. "Just a few more minutes, and we'll get to the deepest point," said Andrew, the group leader, with a confident smile. "It will be a challenge, but we will get through it without a hitch." But something began to change. At first, it was just a sensation, something subtle that others didn't seem to notice. A strange pressure in the air, as if the darkness itself were absorbing the light from their flashlights. As they advanced further and further, the cave seemed to transform. The corridors became narrower, the rocks sharper, and a piercing cold penetrated to the bone. "Why don't the flashlights shine well?" asked Laura, one of the youngest hikers in the group, staring at her flashlight in bewilderment. "No matter what I do, the light seems weaker." Andrew frowned, adjusting the light of his own flashlight, but he also noticed that the light was not as powerful as it should be. "It must be some kind of reflection or something with the walls," he said in a reassuring tone. "Humidity probably plays tricks." However, as they advanced, the darkness seemed to engulf them more and more. The walls of the cave were strangely smooth in places, as if the rock had been molded by an invisible hand. The sounds of their own footsteps became more and more muffled, as if the air was absorbing every noise they made. And in the silence, something began to disturb them even more. It wasn't just fear, but a deep, growing sense that something was watching them, stalking them from the shadows. "Did you hear that?" muttered Carlos, another member of the group. Everyone stopped and listened, but the silence was deep. There was no trace of life in the air, only an abyss of stillness. "I think it's the echo of our voices," Andrew said, trying to downplay the situation. "We're in a cave, after all." But no one could shake the feeling that they were not alone. Suddenly, one of the corridors widened, offering a small cave inside. The group decided to go inside, thinking that maybe it was the perfect place to get some rest before continuing their exploration. However, as soon as they entered, the air seemed to become heavier, as if something was accumulating around them. Laura looked around nervously. "There's something weird about this place. It's like vibrating." Carlos began to move through the space, touching the walls of the cave. "Nothing weird here, just rocks," he said, but his voice sounded unconvinced. Suddenly he stopped and looked at the ceiling. "What's that?" Everyone looked up, and a shiver ran down their spines at the sight of the strange marks on the walls. They looked like hand-carved symbols, although they were completely unknown. Some of them twisted and bent in almost unnatural ways, as if they were alive. "It's like he's cursed," Laura said, her voice trembling. Andres frowned, trying to rationalize the situation. "They're probably just marks made by ancient explorers. Come on, let's not panic." But panic was beginning to seep into their minds. The cave no longer felt like a simple abandoned place, but like something much darker, something that had been waiting for its arrival. The light from the flashlights flickered once more, and this time it wasn't because of the humidity. "We have to get out of here," Carlos said, his voice strained. "This doesn't feel right. We need to get back to the point of entry." "Okay," Andrew replied, "but we need to find our way back first." As they tried to find their way around, they began to realize that the hallways were not the same. The road by which they had come seemed to have vanished. Each time they advanced, the terrain seemed to change, twisting and bending in ways they couldn't comprehend. The cave seemed to be alive, changing according to its movement, as if it was trapping them in an endless maze. Why does everything look different now?" murmured Laura, her voice breaking. "This cannot be possible." Suddenly, the sound of something ripping at the rock broke the air, followed by a low whisper gliding through the cave. It was a strange sound, almost as if someone was walking in the shadows, too close to be ignored. "We are being watched!" cried Carlos, his face pale with terror. A figure suddenly appeared before them, emerging from the shadows with frightful slowness. It wasn't fully human, but it wasn't a completely unknown creature either. His body seemed to be composed of an amalgam of rocks and shadows, and his face was a distorted mask, devoid of clear features. There were no eyes, only a deep darkness that seemed to absorb the light from the lanterns. "What the hell is that?" Laura shouted, recoiling in terror. The figure slid closer, the air around him growing colder. The sense of panic increased, and their hearts were pounding, as if they could hear the creature's heartbeat echoing in their chests. "Run!" shouted Andrew as the creature slithered toward them. But the way out seemed to have vanished completely, as if the cave was holding them back, sealing off all possible escape routes. The creature came even closer, its form fading and reappearing as if it were between the worlds. In an instant, one of the flashlights went out, plunging them into an even deeper darkness. "We can't stay here. He's going to catch us," shouted Laura, taking Carlos's hand. "We have to." But the creature was above them, and the darkness enveloped them completely. Fear, terror, and panic took hold of them. There was no escape, and then everything went out. In an ancient city marked by the shadows of time and cobbled streets, there was a gallery in which the most extravagant art collectors looked for unique pieces, objects that transcended mere aesthetics and the whims of fashion. It was a gallery that was not easily found. Only those with a true passion for the macabre and the strange knew of its existence. On a dark, foggy night, a man named Nicholas Hernandez, an art collector known for his obsession with the unusual, arrived at that hidden gallery. From the first moment he walked in, he knew something wasn't right. The walls, of a grayish and opaque color, were covered with paintings that seemed to observe him. The eyes on the paintings followed him, no matter where he was headed. However, it was one particular work that captured his attention. An old painting, framed with aged and weathered wood, stood isolated on a wall, as if waiting to be seen. The image was disturbing. It showed a human figure, a woman in the middle of a desolate and gloomy landscape. Around him, dark beings seemed to stalk him, shadows of what might have been people or something far stranger. The painting had a strange, almost tangible energy, as if the figure on the canvas was alive, waiting to be released. The owner of the gallery, an old man with eyes that seemed to hide dark secrets, approached Nicholas without saying a word, but his gaze invited him closer to the painting. "It's a rare piece," the old man murmured, his voice raspy and deep. "Of an artist who disappeared years ago. Some say that painting has life, that whoever owns it will become part of it." The comment, far from frightening Nicholas, aroused his curiosity even more. Throughout his career as a collector, he had seen all kinds of disturbing paintings, but there was something special about this one, not only because of its artistic quality, but also because of the feeling that something in the painting breathed, something that did not belong to the physical world. "How much does it cost?" asked Nicholas, already determined to possess her. The old man smiled with a grimace that seemed more like a warning than a sign of satisfaction. "It's not about money. Only those who are destined to possess it can do so. If you really want this painting, you should know that the price is not what it seems." Nicholas, impatient and blinded by his desire, nodded without question. The old man gestured for her to follow him, and once outside the gallery, handed him the painting without further words. Back home, Nicholas placed the painting in the main room of his mansion. The image of the woman in the dark landscape seemed to change according to the light, as if the characters in the background were moving slowly, like shadows sliding across the painting. As the days went by, Nicholas began to notice that he couldn't stop looking at her. He felt attracted to her, as if something invisible was calling him to observe her more closely, as if the woman's figure was watching him. One night, as I sat in front of the painting, an inexplicable chill began to run through the room. The woman's figure seemed to come to life, her face distorted into an expression of anguish. Nicholas felt a chill run down his spine, but he couldn't look away. Characters who were previously shadows in the background now moved more clearly. The eyes of the woman in the painting seemed full of despair, as if she were trapped in that landscape waiting for someone to free her. As the days passed, the effects of the painting intensified. Nicholas began to hear whispers in the house. Distant voices, which I could not identify, murmured from the darkness. Sometimes, when he walked through the mansion, he thought he saw the figures in the painting moving behind him, always out of his field of vision. Every time he tried to turn away from the painting, a sense of discomfort came over him, as if something was watching him from the shadows. One afternoon, Nicholas woke up in his chair in front of the painting as if he hadn't slept in days. The eyes of the woman in the painting no longer showed despair, but a cold indifference. But the scariest thing was what he saw in the background. The dark figures in the painting had approached. They were no longer just shadows. Now they were complete figures, with grotesque and deformed faces, whose eyes shone with an evil light. Nicholas tried to get up, but something was holding him in place. His body was unresponsive. He was trapped, as if the paint had absorbed him. Desperation took hold of him. He screamed, but his voice did not come out. Around him, the figures in the painting began to move faster, getting closer and closer. He could feel their presences beside him, as if his hands were touching him, brushing against him coldly. Nicholas was trapped in a world within the painting, a dimension of horror and anguish. I couldn't escape, I couldn't get out. He could only watch, helpless, as the shadows surrounded him. Panic gripped his soul. He looked at the woman's figure, but she was no longer a mere image. It was in front of him, his face transformed into a distorted grimace of suffering. The woman stared at him, and in her eyes, Nicholas saw the same despair he felt. She had been caught up in that world as well, and now he was destined to take her place. At that moment, Nicholas understood the truth. Not only did the painting come to life, it absorbed those who possessed it, trapping them in its dark and distorted realm. The figures in the background were now completely distorted shapes, with no clear faces, just bright eyes watching Nicholas as they dragged him into the darkness. He tried to scream, but he couldn't anymore. His body was disappearing, crumbling as if it were part of the painting. His skin melted into the colors of the canvas, and his muscles were transformed into patches of pigment. Nicholas, the collector who had wanted to own the work, was no longer human. He had been absorbed by painting. his soul condemned to live eternally in that world of shadows. In the gallery, the painting had changed. The woman's figure was now accompanied by the figure of Nicholas, her face disfigured into an expression of horror and despair. The figures in the background were still lurking, always watching, always waiting for the next unwary person to become part of their world. Painting, once a simple work of art, was now a portal to a distorted reality, where trapped souls lived in endless torment. And so the cursed painting kept waiting, waiting for the next collector, waiting for someone else to fall into its trap, to be consumed by the terror and obsession that emanated from its colors. No one would ever know the full story, only that those who stared too long at the painting, those who obsessed over it, ended up being swallowed by the darkness it contained. In that dark and gloomy corner of art, shadows were always waiting, and painting, always thirsting for souls, would never fail to attract the unwary who got too close. It was a gray day when Daniel and Laura decided to escape the hustle and bustle of the city. After months of constant stress, they decided that all they needed was the fresh air of the forest and the tranquility of a cabin away from everything. A couple of days, just the two of them, surrounded by nature, where they could relax without worries. The cabin they rented was in a small, secluded corner, where there were no houses nearby and hardly any phone signals. The road meandered between tall trees that towered like giants, mostly covering the sunlight. When they arrived, they realized how far away everything really was. There was not a store, not a sign of human life for miles around. The cabin was small, rustic but cozy. Outside, time seemed to have stopped, as if it were a refuge forgotten by all. "This is perfect," Laura said, dropping her suitcase on the dusty porch floor. "We need this. Time to disconnect." Daniel smiled, though he couldn't deny that something in the air was strange to him. There was something unsettling about the stillness of the place. But he ignored it, thinking it was just his mind burdened by the pressures of the city. What he didn't know was that the calm they longed for would be interrupted by something much more terrifying. The cabin had the essentials: a fireplace that crackled softly, a kitchenette, and a couple of cozy rooms. As they settled in, Daniel and Laura felt more relaxed, forgetting the stresses of work and everyday life. But soon, the first shadows of uneasiness began to appear. That night, after a quiet dinner by the fire, they retired to their room. As Laura settled into bed, Daniel leaned out of the window, looking out the forest around the cabin. The full moon was high in the sky, but it wasn't enough to illuminate the thickness of the trees. "I couldn't help but feel a sense of being watched, even though I couldn't see anything." "Is everything okay?" asked Laura from the bed. "Yes, just the silence is so absolute here," Daniel replied, closing the curtain and turning off the light. But when he tried to sleep, Daniel's sleep was interrupted by strange noises, a distant creak, as if something or someone is moving through the trees. At first he thought it might be an animal, but then the sound repeated, closer, as if someone was approaching the cabin. Daniel tried to ignore it, blaming it on the stress and loneliness of the place. But the creaks continued until a loud bang made him get out of bed. "Did you hear that?" Daniel whispered, looking at Laura, who was already awake. She nodded, looking out the window. "Yes, as if someone is nearby. Should we go and look?" "Number. Let's better stay here and check tomorrow. It's very dark outside." Laura wasn't so sure. Something in the air kept her alert, but she trusted Daniel, and the cabin was safe, or so she thought. The next morning, they didn't mention the noises of the night. The light of day brought with it a false sense of security. They decided to take a walk in the woods, exploring the surroundings. As they walked, Daniel felt the strange sensation of being watched again. Every time he turned his head, he saw nothing, but the feeling lingered, as if something was watching them from the shadows of the trees. "I don't know, Laura. This place scares me a little. Perhaps we should have looked for something closer to civilization." "Come on, don't be paranoid. It's just a forest and we're all alone." "There's something soothing about this silence," Laura replied, though she also felt a growing discomfort in her chest. As they moved deeper into the forest, the sound of their footsteps and the breeze moving the leaves of the trees were the only things that broke the silence. But as they advanced, something else began to add tension to the atmosphere. Some branches creaked near them, and when they looked, they saw nothing and no one. "Who else could be here?" muttered Daniel, looking around more nervously. "Don't worry, it's just an animal. Let's keep walking," Laura said, though her words lacked the confidence she had had before. By the time they returned to the cabin, Night had already begun to fall, and the sense of unease intensified. That night, terror did not take long to arrive. During dinner, Laura and Daniel tried to talk about anything to distract themselves, but something in the air made the words feel empty. It was after dinner, when Daniel sat down in the chair by the fireplace, that they heard a creak again, but this time louder, almost above their heads. The two looked at each other, their eyes full of dread. "What was that?" asked Laura, her voice trembling. "I think something is on the ceiling." Daniel got up quickly, looking up anxiously. It's impossible." The noises continued. As they intensified, they began to hear what seemed like footsteps dragging on the ceiling, heavy as if someone was walking on the wooden beams. The thought that someone could be there watching them caused terror to take hold of them. "We have to get out of here," Laura said, visibly terrified. "But we can't. We are very far from anywhere. We have no other options. Maybe it's just the wind or an animal. We're going to close everything, lock the gates, and wait for it to happen." Paranoia began to creep into their minds, as the sense that they were not alone became more and more palpable. Upon returning to their room, the sound of something hitting the windows made them jump in fear. "The window. Look at the window," Laura whispered, pointing to the window. Something dark and blurry moved on the other side. Fear gripped them as the sound of scratching on the window continued. Laura tried to take a closer look, but she couldn't see anything. However, he felt that something was stalking them from the outside. "We have to go now," exclaimed Daniel, clutching his jacket in despair. "Come on, Laura, come on." But when they both tried to open the door to escape, something stopped them. The door wouldn't budge. It was sealed from the outside. Panic set in when they discovered they couldn't open the door. They tried with all their might, but the lock seemed to have been locked from the outside. Laura, her face pale, began to breathe rapidly, her mind working at 1,000 miles an hour. Daniel stared at her desperately, trying to find a solution, but all he saw was darkness and the creaking of wood around them. "We can't stay here. Something is not right. What the hell is going on?" said Daniel, sweating and looking anxiously into every corner of the room. Suddenly, the lamplight went out, plunging the room into complete darkness. The creaking of the wood coming from the ceiling now felt closer, as if someone was slowly descending, approaching them. Both of them, paralyzed with fear, approached the window, but something in the air told them that looking outside would only make things worse. "We have to get out of here no matter what it takes," Laura said in a trembling voice. Laura began to bang on the window with all her might, but the glass would not give way. Suddenly, a figure appeared in the darkness outside, its dark outline silhouetted against the dim moonlight. Daniel screamed, but the voice choked in his throat as he saw the silhouette moving through the trees, watching them mercilessly. "What is that? Who's there?" asked Laura, her voice breaking. There was no response, only the growing sense that something horrible was about to happen. The figure stood there, motionless, its eyes fixed on them. Panic began to engulf them as they tried to find a way out, but the feeling that they were being watched only intensified. "Help me!" shouted Laura, finally giving in to the terror that consumed her. But there was no response. The world seemed to have stopped, and the only sound was the rustling of trees swaying in the wind. Without warning, the figure disappeared into the trees. Daniel breathed heavily, trying to process what he had just seen. The figure that had been lurking around the hut seemed to fade into nothingness, but the feeling of being watched didn't go away. Something was not right. There was something they couldn't see, but around them, like a presence seeping through the shadows, lurking. The clock on the wall made an almost imperceptible sound, but loud enough to break the absolute silence. Laura and Daniel looked at each other in terror, the words getting stuck in their throats. "We can't stay here," Daniel muttered as he tried to think of a way out. "We have to find a way out." With their hearts racing, they began to look for any possible way to escape. But it was at that moment that the door burst open, as if something had unlocked it from the outside. Moonlight immediately poured in, illuminating the room in eerie shadows. The figure was gone, but the sense of danger was stronger than ever. Without thinking twice, Daniel and Laura left the cabin in a hurry, running into the woods without looking back. The ground was wet and branches hit their faces as they ran frantically. They could hear footsteps behind them, the rustling of branches and leaves moving. They didn't know if it was the figure chasing them or something more sinister, but they didn't dare to look. "Run, Laura! Run!" shouted Daniel, feeling his breath ragged. Anxiety consumed them, and every second it seemed like something was catching up with them. But when they turned to see if there was anything behind it, the figure was gone. There was no trace of anything, only the thick fog that began to envelop them. The trees, which had once seemed harmless, now stood like dark giants, and the darkness of the forest seemed to devour them. There was no visible path, no lights, only the thick gloom that surrounded them. Daniel and Laura reached the edge of the forest, where the road seemed distant as if they could never reach it. The feeling of dread consumed them, but at that moment, Laura fell to her knees, exhausted and trembling. "What's going on? Why can't we get out of here?" sobbed Laura, looking out over the woods where the shadows moved as if they were alive. Daniel tried to comfort her, but he also felt the growing despair. Something was catching them, something much bigger than them, something they couldn't understand. Suddenly, a heart-rending scream echoed through the air, a voice that was not human. Something appeared on the threshold of the trees, a tall figure shrouded in darkness. His face was an indescribable shadow, but his eyes, two empty abysses, shone with a frightful intensity. The figure was watching them, and something in his eyes made their skin stand on end. "No, it can't be," shouted Daniel, as the figure slowly advanced towards them. Fear paralyzed them. They didn't know what that thing was or where it had come from. They only knew that they could not escape. The air around them thickened, as if time itself had stopped. The figure raised his arm, pointing at them, and a barely audible whisper could be heard in the wind. Laura and Daniel's name was whispered in their ears like a distant echo. Suddenly, the ground beneath their feet began to shake, and an invisible force pushed them to the ground. Fear turned to absolute terror. They were no longer in the same place. They had been transported to another world, a gloomy and dark place, where the trees twisted into grotesque shapes, and the air was thick and oppressive. The empty-eyed figure slowly approached them, its shadow enveloping them, and with one swift motion took them, absorbing them in the darkness. The cabin, the forest, everything disappeared in a breath, and all that remained was the sound of the wind, carrying with it the whispers of those who had been observed, until they could never be reached.